We will also consider legislation to reduce emissions from ports, to deploy air pollution monitoring infrastructure, and build capacity of community-based organizations to enable greater participation in environmental and infrastructure decision-making processes. These bills also propose ways to strengthen and improve public participation, codifying Executive Order 12898 and its requirements for integration of environmental justice across federal agencies, requiring EJ, training of federal employees, and meetings between EPA and community groups to improve collaboration and communication. Finally, the Clean Future Act, much like the Biden administration's commitment, requires that 40% of funds made available be used to support activities directly benefiting environmental justice communities. So I look forward to today's discussion and yield back my time. And I now recognize Mr. McKinley, our ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environmental and Climate Change. Representative McKinley, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Chairman, recently I read an article citing the World Health Organization's definition of poverty. But their measurement of poverty, simply in terms of per capita income, seems inadequate. According to the article, among the poor, poverty is better understood in terms of shame, powerlessness, hopelessness, and humiliation. This hearing on environmental justice is central to an agenda to eliminate fossil fuels from the power sector by 2035. The consequences of which will leave workers, families, children, and entire communities in poverty. Mr. Chairman, where's the justice in that? Think about it. Extremists have been spending years shaming coal miners and oil field workers, blaming them for causing wildfires, flooding and droughts, hurricanes, low birth weight babies, premature deaths, as you just mentioned, and asthma. And in this new environment, fossil fuel workers feel powerless as liberal Democrats and administration team up to take away their lifelong jobs. And when their jobs are lost and there are no other opportunities in their area, hopelessness will take hold. Will they have to move away? Will they leave their home, their community, their church, their support base? And their house is typically, Mr. Chairman, their biggest asset. So who will buy a house in a dying community? We've asked for these letters to be introduced into the record. And then finally, coal miners and oil field workers have produced a reliable, dependable income for their families. Now they're going to be humbled into welfare and food stamps and waiting for transition jobs that historically never materialize. Workers will be losing their dignity, not for what they did, but for what government did to them. And the cruel irony of all this, as America dismantles its fossil fuel economy, the rest of the world is expanding its use of coal, natural gas, and oil, and emitting greenhouse gases at an alarmingly increasing rate. So by eliminating jobs in fossil fuels, Congress will be sentencing American workers all across the country into poverty. How is that outcome any different than the injustices created in the past? So maybe it's time, Mr. Chairman, that the men and women of government to lose their sanctimonious attitude and walk in the shoes of these families who are about to experience poverty, all in this guise of justice. Oh yeah, Mr. Chair. The workers will be offered unrealistic promises about just transition into jobs in the renewable sector. But even former Secretary Moniz has concluded that new replacement jobs and the green jobs will pay significantly less and will have an impact on their families. And workers in the coal and natural gas industries are well aware of how government injustices in the past betrayed their fellow workers in steel, electronics, and textiles. Look, fossil fuel workers simply want to keep their jobs, not get a government handout or a government program. This misguided congressional pursuit of environmental justice will no doubt create poverty, causing shame, powerlessness, hopelessness, and humiliation to hardworking Americans. So instead of perpetuating another generation of injustice, Wouldn't it be more respectful to accomplish our mutual objective in reducing carbon emissions by using innovation and research and advancing efficiencies, renewables, nuclear, and batteries? So look, poverty is poverty, Mr. Chairman. Injustice is injustice. It's whether it's in an urban area or in a rural community. Now, Paul, I know you. If you can prevent poverty for just one family in your district in New York, I'm confident that you would fight like hell in their behalf. So I'm confused. Why is the rest of your party turning a deaf ear to the pleas of men, women, and children with fossil fuel jobs and subjecting whole communities to poverty? Is that what Democrats call environmental justice? Hurting working families is not a justice that any of us should embrace. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Representative McKinley yields back, and now the chair recognizes Representative Pallone, the chair of the full committee, Energy and Commerce, our overtime hardworking chair. We recognize him for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Welcome, Chairman Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Today, we continue this committee's important work on environmental justice as we examine 11 bills that address the pressing needs of environmental justice communities. And for far too long, low-income communities and communities of color have borne the brunt of air pollution, exposure to contaminated sites, and unsafe water. Environmental injustice can be attributed to many things, from intentionally racist policies like redlining that lead to vulnerable communities being excluded from siting and permitting decisions, to unequal investment in these communities, and climate change and deteriorating infrastructure are exacerbating these problems and this inequality. So it's time for Congress to act. As Chairman Tonko said, we must address the overlapping crises facing our nation, including inequality, climate change, and the economic downturn caused by this pandemic. And as President Biden has said, we need to build back better, and that means building back cleaner, healthier, and with greater equity. So I believe the 11 bills before us today can help us do exactly that. One of the bills is H.R. 1512, the Clean Future Act, which I introduced last month with Chairman Tonko and Rush and several other committee members. And the Clean Future Act is a comprehensive and ambitious plan to combat the climate crisis and achieve net zero greenhouse gas pollution by no later than 2050. And environmental justice is a key component of the Clean Future Act and must be a focus of our efforts to address climate change and infrastructure. But many of the environmental justice provisions in the Clean Future Act are reflected in President Biden's American Jobs Plan. Both proposals prioritize investments for environmental justice communities and basically commit 40% of investments to directly benefiting these communities. And both proposals seek to clean up the sectors of our economy, like the ports, that not only increase the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but also add to the amount of hazardous air pollutants concentrated in environmental justice communities. And both policy proposals make the long overdue investments in cleaning up Superfund sites, replacing lead service lines, and updating the energy grid. Now, the other bills we're going to hear about today focus on important environmental justice topics, including climate justice, port climate readiness, cumulative impacts assessments, and the tools available to identify environmental justice communities. And many of these bills align with the American Jobs Plan and can help us make that plan a reality. So I want to thank my colleagues for their engagement and help in refining and expanding the environmental justice provisions of the Clean Future Act. And I also commend them for their leadership on the other bills that we're developing or that we're discussing today. All these bills reflect thoughtful stakeholder engagement with communities of color and low-income communities, and I'm proud to continue that engagement with today's hearings. But I also want to thank our witnesses who are leaders and experts in environmental justice communities. We're fortunate to have this panel with us today, and I hope we can have a constructive dialogue and work with these stakeholders to enact needed change. But let me just emphasize, if I can, Chairman Tonko, that environmental justice can and should be a bipartisan issue. Many of us were excited to pass environmental justice provisions out of the House as part of last year's energy bill. And although we did get about half of that energy bill in the final omnibus, we were disappointed because we couldn't find the bipartisan support we needed to get the environmental justice provisions included in that omnibus bill. So I hope we can find common ground and build on support, because I know that these problems that exist in environmental justice communities, are throughout the country, not just in in Democratic districts. In fact, I always point out that when we did a brownfields bill, I don't know, 20 years ago now, it was with Congressman Gilmore, and it was when my former governor Whitman was the EPA administrator, and George Bush was president. So there's no reason that this can't be bipartisan. And also the notion of building back better does require bold action and a focus on the communities most in need. So I think the bills before us today are a good start. I thank Chairman Tonko for calling this important hearing, and look forward to working together to see environmental justice provisions enacted into law. And with that, I'll yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
You're most welcome. The gentleman, the chair yields back. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Rogers. Representative Rogers serves as ranking member of the full committee. And Representative Rogers, you have 5 minutes now for your opening statement, please.
Good morning, everyone. Mr. Chairman, throughout these Clean Future Act hearings, Republicans have stressed that to address climate change and the climate risk, the policies we develop must strengthen, not weaken, our communities. You cannot build back better if you're tearing down to do it. Policies must recognize the vital role affordable, reliable energy serves for expanding economic opportunity, for enabling new work opportunities, increasing community resilience, for expanding prosperity, for providing affordable power to homes when we need it. We do this by building on current achievements in energy, in environmental improvements, and economic opportunity, not dismantling them. We've all seen the human toll when economic opportunity abandons communities. Witnesses in the past have outlined the harsh economic, social, and physical harm that follows the loss of good blue-collar middle-class jobs as factories pull out or power plants close. Whether the harm is due to lost economic opportunity or not having the opportunity in the first place, we should remove barriers and provide incentives to lift economic prospects for all Americans, but especially for those that need it the most. The legislation before us today covers so much ground, it's easy to overlook some of the ways the Clean Future Act harms economic prospects. We've warned in previous hearings that mandates like those in this bill will raise electricity rates, sideline small businesses, and increase energy poverty for those who need it. And consider some of the provisions under review today that would further weaken economic opportunity. Section 606 of the Clean Future Act prohibits new and renewed permits for projects and census tracts identified as, quote, overburdened, whether or not the projects contribute to the burdens. There's no room here for state or local decisions, what workers or communities want. Amazingly, one trigger for prohibiting permits is set at air emissions levels that are within current air quality standards. It's not the way to foster economic opportunity or improve public health. Another provision, Section 621, creates new regulations on carbon capture and storage for enhanced oil recovery, a key incentive for building out carbon capture for clean energy. This provision duplicates existing regulations and imposes impractical permitting requirements that may undermine future development of this technology and the jobs it will create. Section 625 establishes a clear federal role for hydraulic fracturing and forces new requirements on state regulation of hydraulic fracturing, a practice the states have handled without federal intervention for many decades. These new changes would upend the regulatory structure that helped drive the shale revolution, transforming American energy security, lowering our greenhouse gas emission levels, and providing new economic life to scores of communities around our nation. Add in other provisions of this bill, and we're looking at an economic train wreck, not the way to help frontline communities. We can do better than this. And we can start by recognizing the tremendous progress we've made as a nation in the terms of environmental improvements under existing state and federal policies. Fine particulate matter is declining, down an average of almost 40% since 2000. Our air quality levels are 5 times lower than the global average, 7 times lower than China's, well below France, Germany, Mexico, and Russia, according to the EPA. And these positive environmental trends will continue, as will the economic and clean energy opportunities if we don't block the way with convoluted new regulatory policies. Let's focus on incentives to economic development, especially for underserved communities, with ground up bipartisan policies like opportunity zones. I'm pleased that Mr. Shay Hawkins is joining us this morning to update us on how these policies help communities that are in need of economic opportunity. Mr. Derek Hawley will remind us of the vital role of affordable energy for economic progress and the risk of heavy regulation on energy. Mr. Chairman, we can drive clean energy policies, improve economic and environmental health, and foster prosperity for all families. But the ingredients for success are not more regulations, mandates, and central control that stifles opportunity and freedom. Let's recognize that, and let's recognize our successes and build on that. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair reminds members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. I now will introduce the wonderful witnesses that we have for today's hearing. And we again thank them for joining us and for sharing info with us. Dr. Mildred Mclean is our first witness to be introduced. She's the Executive Director of Harambe House Citizens for Environmental Justice. We then have Mr. Angelo Logan, Campaign Director, Moving Forward Network. Ms. Elizabeth Pierre, I hope I said that correctly. And she serves as Executive Director of UPROS. And Mr. Derek Hawley, who's founder of Reaching America. Mr. Shay Hawkins, who's president of Opportunity Funds Association. And finally, Dr. Adrian Hollis, Senior Climate Justice and Health Scientist of the Union of Concerned Scientists. I remind all of our witnesses to please unmute as you're called upon to share your thoughts for 5 minutes. And we'll begin now by recognizing Dr. Mclean for 5 minutes to provide an opening statement. Dr. Mclean, please unmute, and the floor is yours.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me because I can barely hear you.
We can hear you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to testify today. My name is Dr. McClain. I'm the Executive Director of the Harambe House Citizens for Environmental Justice, located in Savannah, Georgia. And we are a community-based organization that have worked for the last 32 years with families, organizations, communities throughout this country in building the capacity of regular people to have their voice heard in environmental decision-making. I've submitted written testimony, so I just want to highlight a couple of things this morning verbally. There are a number of legislative proposals under discussion today, and I'm going to focus my comments on HR 2021, the Environmental Justice for All Act. This is a promising start, but it's not where we want to finally end up. It is a bill that was built up from the ground up, and that is very, very, very important. For far too long, environmental justice communities have suffered the devastating impacts of having to disproportionately bear the burdens of exposure to multiple sources of pollution, including alarming rates of respiratory illnesses, cancer, and premature deaths, as has been said earlier. Rightly, this bill attempts to address this problem by investing in local communities, increasing transparency, and empowering impacted stakeholders to hold polluters accountable. The process by which this bill was developed deserves particular attention. Representative McKitchen and Chairman Grahava developed this legislation from the ground up, with impacted communities leading and driving the development of the bill. To address environmental injustice, the process really does matter. I want to pull out two important parts of the act that are very important, two key features. And one looks at the cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts requires consideration in permitting decisions under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and ensures that permits will not be issued if the project cannot demonstrate a reasonable certainty of no harm to human health. Cumulative impacts is all about the concentration of polluting industries in heavily burdened neighborhoods. There must be consideration of denying a permit if there is any chance of harm. Let us put the burden of proof on the applicant. Secondly, a feature that I want to uplift is the Executive Order 12898, which codifies and bolsters President Clinton's 1994 executive order by directing federal agencies to develop EJ strategies and to regularly report on implementation and progress. It also ensures that federal agencies include diverse communities in public health research, data collection, and analysis, but it's not a law, it's an order. When codified and put into law, made a legal obligation, this allows for accountability in federal agencies. The fact is, many agencies do not comply with executive orders. Therefore, they must be required under the law. This gives community, the public, tools to hold folks accountable. Where agencies do not comply, the public can then complain about non-compliance and do something about it. A lack of enforcement of existing laws and regulations from EPA and state permit regulators is a major component of the challenge that needs to be addressed. That is to say, there is often a breakdown between the regs on the books and how that translates to improving residents' lives on the ground. The Clinton executive order takes steps to address this, but as I said earlier, an executive order can be overturned with the stroke of a pen. That is why we need Congress to codify agency accountability mechanisms into law, like the Environmental Justice for All Act does with the Executive Order 1289, as well as with the recent Biden executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad that calls for interagency coordination as well as accountability. I want to just highlight one thing in my written testimony before I close. We are calling for you to legislate consistent and enforceable regulatory tools to end the disproportionate and cumulative impact of multiple pollution sources and toxic exposures on overburdened environmental justice communities. As this committee proceeds with its work, I urge you all to be thinking about how we can even add greater protections and programs to the Environmental Justice for All Act and build on the community's framework that is reflected in this important legislation. I close with a quote from Martin Luther King. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are Americans, and as the bill titles suggest, this is our vision, environmental justice for all. And so I thank you for allowing me to talk today, and I'll be open for answering any questions.
Thank you. We thank you, Dr. McLean, and please ask people to stay within the 5-minute boundaries, please. So thank you so much. We'll now move to Mr. Logan. You are recognized, sir, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member McKinley, and members of the committee. My name is Angela Logan, and I'm with the Moving Forward Network. The Moving Forward Network is a national coalition of over 50 organizations in 20 cities committed to environmental justice with a focus on ports and freight transportation. Ultimately, you cannot address environmental justice without addressing ports and freight transportation, focusing on self-determination, cumulative impacts, toxic exposure, investing in EJ communities, and just transition. As a major environmental justice issue, ports and more broadly freight transportation is a complex system that weaves seaports, freight corridors, rail yards, intermodal facilities, inland ports, and logistics centers. The communities where these facilities are located not only contend with freight impacts, but are also inundated by a wide variety of other impacts, such as refineries, trash incinerators, Superfund sites, and many more. So without a doubt, freight communities are clear examples of the need for cumulative impact policies. Environmental justice communities are hit first and worst by the climate crisis. The freight system is a major source of diesel pollution, which creates CO2, a major greenhouse gas. Freight transport contributes approximately 3 billion tons of CO2 globally. The freight sector accounts for roughly 9% of US greenhouse gas emissions, and in the next couple of decades, it is expected that ocean-going vessels alone will account for about 17% of all man-made carbon dioxide emissions. The 13 million people that live near ports and rail yards are majority communities of color and have an increased health risk. Freight transportation alone puts African Americans at a high risk that is 3 times their proportion of the US, and Latinos make up 2 times their proportion. To that end, I would like you to consider taking the following actions. 1, advance proposals that center community voices, self-determination, local solutions, and have incorporated a comprehensive community process. One of the proposals before you today, HR 2021, has incorporated a comprehensive community-led approach. The committee facilitated environmental justice working group resulted in the committee establishing a statement of policy principles for this environmental justice legislation. 2, do not advance parts, pieces, or sections of proposals that harm environmental justice communities. Proposals that incorporate market mechanisms, trading schemes, biomass, and other strategies that continue to burden EJ communities are non-starters and have been strongly opposed by environmental justice communities for many years. 3, tackle environmental racism. Address cumulative impacts head-on. Continuous permitting of polluting facilities in already overburdened communities perpetuate environmental racism. Any serious environmental justice proposal must contain a cumulative impacts policy that includes permit denials within the strategy. 4, invest in clean air plans, zero-emission freight vehicles, and equipment at ports. On one hand, environmental justice for port communities include creating local solutions and planning, the development of clean air plans for ports that identify the problem, solutions, and actions. The need to eliminate local toxic pollution and climate pollutants is critical and must start with a community-led process. On the other hand, the approach to reducing local toxic emissions and climate pollutants must involve investing in the deployment of zero-emission freight vehicles, equipment, and infrastructure. Eliminating diesel pollution is critical if we are going to protect community health and address the climate crisis. It is critical that both HR 501 and HR 862 include organized labor engagement and that investments require labor protections. Community residents should have the right to both a healthy environment and high-quality careers. 5, environmental justice includes a just transition. As polluting industries are phased out, pathways for workers in those industries must be developed to support a transition to new quality careers. 6, do not enable freight automation. Zero-emission technologies at ports do not mean automation, nor should technologies that would negatively impact frontline workers be supported. 7, require EPA to adopt regulations that reduce and eliminate emissions from the freight sector. The following should be the next generation of national emission standards prioritized by EPA. National standards for heavy-duty trucks, new standards for ocean-going vessels, national standards for locomotive engines. These rules should include timelines and requirements for the deployment of zero-emission technologies. In closing, I would like to emphasize that community engagement for developing solutions and strategies is paramount. To that end, we encourage the committee continued engagement directly with the MFN membership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Logan. And next we'll recognize Ms. Jean-Pierre. You are recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Buenos dias, Ashe. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, and I am co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance, a national organization that links more than 75 organizations across the U.S., Guam, and Puerto Rico. I'm also executive director of Uprose, Brooklyn's oldest Latino organization. We work at the intersection of justice, climate change, and the Frontline climate justice movement, representing those most impacted by climate change. Like climate change, the conditions of our communities are the consequence of a long history of extraction. We share legacies of fighting colonialism as well as race, class, and gender oppression while advocating for environmental justice. Our communities are the first and most impacted by the storms, fires, floods, and droughts, and are disproportionately burdened by pollution, poverty, and systemic violence associated with the multinational corporations driving these ecological crises. Years of grassroots organizing and frontline community leadership by members of New York Renews won the hard-fought battle for New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the most progressive climate policy in the nation, paving the way for models and processes that are community-led solutions grounded in racial justice and equity. These community-led models serve as a foundation from which the federal government can accelerate a just transition. Congresswoman Yvette Clarke's proposal for a climate justice working group represents an important step forward for the prior and informed consent of frontline communities in a just and equitable transition towards a clean, zero-emission economy that protects and prioritizes our communities. We applaud the bill for centering representatives from frontline community-based organizations as advisors and experts on matters pertaining to the impacts of climate change and environmental pollution in our communities. In order to transition away from fossil fuels, improve health conditions in severely polluted communities, and strengthen social cohesion, we must redress past harms, create new relationships of power that ensure the self-determination of communities and include the expertise of frontline leadership. Uprose is located in Lenape territory, also known as Sunset Park, Brooklyn. It is a diverse working class community where the majority of the residents are people of color. Housing affordability is a major crisis, with nearly half our neighbors being rent burdened and the city undergoing extreme gentrification that will only worsen with the expansion of opportunity zones. It's also an industrial waterfront community exposed to flooding from hurricanes and storm surges, as we saw in 2012 with Superstorm Sandy. We know the history of environmental racism led to the disparate impacts of COVID-19, a public health crisis, where infection and death rates were significantly higher among our people. This bill's proposed climate justice working group would work to protect and prioritize frontline communities in greenhouse gas emission reduction, co-pollutant reductions, and investments. The set of criteria to identify climate burdened communities not only looks at the public health impacts, but also takes on a necessary holistic approach. This transition away from fossil fuels and the extractive economy must be just and equitable, redressing past harms and creating new relationships of power for the future through reparations, living wage jobs, and an economic and social development that aims to address historical harm and systemic racism. All around the country, there are examples of frontline communities developing projects that engage in innovative infrastructure, further local control, and create jobs. Some of these projects are in their early stages. My organization, Uprose, partnered with the New York City Economic Development Corporation, Solar One, and Co-op Power to create the first community-owned solar cooperative in New York State. Projects like these are scalable and replicable community-led models of development and investment. As the bearers of the historical and present-day brunts of environmental degradation and climate change, our communities must be at the forefront of solutions. Investment in just development plans around the nation through mandatory funding for Block grants earmarked for community-based organizations and community development funds would go even further to repair historical harm and center community innovation for water, land, air, energy resources in both urban and rural areas, as well as Indian countries. Our hopes are that our government will work with us to build a regenerative economy and a just and equitable future. Gracias.
You're most welcome, Donata. And next, we thank you, Ms. Jean-Pierre. And next, we'll welcome Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please, for your opening statement.
Unmute. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Greetings, Chairman Toko, ranking members, McKinley, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity and allow me to speak today. America, an education and policy organization I developed to address complex social issues.
Holly, I think you're muted again. We did hear you.
Can you hear me now? Can you guys hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, do I need to start over?
At the clock and have you start over.
Start over, okay, yes, sir. All right, here we go. Greetings, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member McKinley, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to allow me to speak today. I'm Derek Holly, President of Reaching America, an education and policy organization I developed to address complex social issues impacting African-American communities. One of the issues I do the most work on is reducing energy poverty. Energy poverty exists when low-income families or individuals spend upwards of 30% of their total income on their electric bill. I believe it would be fair to say that many Americans who struggled with rising energy costs before the COVID-19 pandemic are struggling even more now. And with millions still out of work, many Americans are experiencing energy poverty for the first time in their life. And with moratoriums over, some folks' power is being turned off in these same vulnerable communities that these new laws and regulations claim to protect. We know that communities around the country, particularly low-income, minority, rural, and senior citizen communities, suffer from a lack of access of reliable energy sources and spend a disproportionate amount of their income, much higher amounts of their income on electricity costs. And when this happens, it results in energy poverty. Eliminating energy poverty is a goal I think we're all interested in achieving. But in working towards that goal, we need to be mindful of how policies will impact the communities we're trying to serve. When the government creates policies, its first priority should be the welfare of the people, especially those impacted the hardest. And with the uncertainty that still exists from this virus, it would not be prudent to eliminate safe, reliable energy sources like oil and natural gas for unproven and unreliable renewable sources, certainly not right now. Under this current administration, the oil and gas industry is under attack from pipelines to hydraulic fracturing, which has revolutionized how we access our natural resources. A study done by Shell Crescent USA shows end users have saved $1.1 trillion over the past 10 years due to increased natural gas production that has reduced the price of natural gas in the United States. Meanwhile, California, which is rich in its own natural resources, increased crude oil imports from foreign countries from 5% in 1992 to 57% in 2018. This is a glaring example of hypocrisy, and here's why. Just 2 years ago, booming shale production helped the U.S. overtake Saudi Arabia and Russia to become the world's top oil exporter for the first time ever. How can our natural resources be worthy enough to supply the other countries and the rest of the world, but not good enough for us right here at home? My grandfather was a black coal miner in Southwest Virginia, and I had the opportunity to visit that area, and the poverty that exists in rural America is different. And these communities have never recovered from the mines that were shut down years ago, decades ago. My fear, Mr. Chairman, is that the same will happen to these thriving communities that have relied on good-paying oil and gas jobs for generations. I know plenty of black folks in Houston, Dallas, and Louisiana who have worked in the industry, and they are not in agreement with new policies and regulations that will ultimately destroy their lifestyle. I'm a licensed captain, and I fish the Atlantic, the Gulf, and I'm an environmental steward. I recognize we have to protect our planet. However, the bottom line here is the federal clean energy standard that's being proposed is overly ambitious, and it will undoubtedly raise the electricity rates for low-income, minority, rural, and senior citizen communities. It will also put fossil fuels, including natural gas, which has been a game changer, at a complete disadvantage. There are also provisions in this bill concerning eminent domain that will stop pipeline permitting. We have more miles of pipeline in this country than we have roads, and most people are living and breathing just fine. I think we all agree that American people have gone through enough, and with the uncertainty that still exists from this global pandemic of COVID-19, the last thing we need to do is take away good-paying jobs, disrupt people's lifestyle more than it already has, and then destroy an industry that we have relied on for industries. the same industry for centuries, excuse me, the same industry that has allowed us to create a life that Americans have grown to appreciate, from petrochemicals, including plastics, fibers, pharmaceuticals, and your yoga mat, are all at risk of going away right now. We need market-oriented energy policy that will allow America to keep exploring and developing our own natural resources safely and allow us to maintain our energy independence, which will ultimately impact our national security. Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Hawley. And now we'll move to Mr. Hawkins. You're recognized, Mr. Hawkins, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Thank you, Ranking Member McKinley, and the other members of the subcommittee for having me. This is my third time testifying in front of Congress, my second time testifying in front of this committee, so I appreciate you having me. My name is Shay Hawkins. I am the president of the Opportunity Fund Association, a trade association focused on investors, entrepreneurs, and developers in opportunity zones. Prior to founding OFA, I was the majority staff director for the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Energy, Natural Resources, and Infrastructure. And I served as tax counsel for Senator Tim Scott for South Carolina, where we developed the Opportunity Zones provision based on the Investing in Opportunity Act, a bipartisan proposal with 88 House co-sponsors, 44 Democrats, 44 Republicans, and 16 Senate co-sponsors, 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats. Opportunity zones, according to the accounting firm Novogradac, $15 billion have been raised into the vehicles for opportunity zone investing, opportunity funds, and $3 billion of that has been raised in the midst of this pandemic. The Council of Economic Advisors estimates that 1 million Americans will be lifted out of poverty over the next 10 years through this policy. Opportunity zones overlap 294 native lands. 244 opportunity zones overlap native lands. And as you all know, these are communities that are disproportionately affected by environmental challenges. And so as we move forward and look at legislation to serve frontline communities, we have to be very careful that we don't exacerbate these disparate impacts in these communities with unique challenges. So for instance, when we look at Alaska Native communities, policies that would raise oil prices or fuel prices through additional taxation would have a disparate impact on those folks who are dependent on air travel for freight, but also for passenger travel in a way that those of us down here in the lower 48 just couldn't relate to. And so that's just something that we need to bear in mind as we look for bipartisan solutions to serve these frontline communities. Frontline communities overlap opportunity zones and vice versa. We're seeing some amazing things happening in opportunity zones. I was just down in Panama City, Florida, where the St. Joe Company broke ground on a waterfront hotel and standalone restaurant. The parcel that the hotel is built on is city-owned, and the city will lease it to St. Joe Company, providing an immediate benefit of revenue to the residents of Panama City, as well as 150 direct jobs created by that project. Out in San Bernardino, California, a leading real estate investment firm, Ravaging, will be cutting the ribbon on an 11,000 square foot office project. The facility will house San Bernardino County's Children's Department of Behavioral Health, and that'll provide mental wellness care to some of the most vulnerable and underserved members of that community. And we also see operating businesses taking root in critical industries such as clean energy. There are 475 solar energy installations in opportunity zones. 127 wind farms have been developed, and 15 battery plants, all providing electricity right now. And so I look forward to speaking more with the committee and offering whatever I can to help these frontline communities through investment, but also through reasonable, low-cost energy that is secure in its delivery.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. And now we'll go to our final witness, Dr. Adrienne Hollis, and you are recognized, Dr. Hollis, for 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Members Rogers and McKinley, and members of the subcommittee for providing me the opportunity to testify here today. And good morning also to my esteemed co-panelists. My name is Dr. Adrienne Hollis. I'm a senior climate justice and health scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm here to share my perspectives on the impacts of environmental assaults on EJ communities. We're in the midst of a syndemic. A syndemic occurs when a set of 2 or more linked health problems affect the same group of people at the same time and negatively compound each other's effects. EJ communities have existed in the middle of a syndemic for decades, facing challenges of structural racism, environmental injustice, and climate change. Any of these factors on their own is deadly, but together the damage is immeasurable. Add that to existing adverse conditions in communities that survive despite the presence of systemic racism, where poverty exists and incomes have never been healthy, and in some circumstances, neither have the communities. We must acknowledge that the underlying factor, systemic racism against Black, Brown, Native Americans, and Indigenous peoples, affects every aspect of our lives, from education to employment, from housing to healthcare, from the food we eat and the water we drink to the air we breathe. We contribute the least to environmental pollution, and yet we have the most exposure to undrinkable water and unbreathable air. We contribute the least to climate change, yet suffer most from its consequences. Let me share a perfect illustration of a syndemic. It happened last year in western Lake Charles, Louisiana. First, because of systemic racism, activities like redlining and the practice of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, factories and other polluting facilities were placed in EJ communities. In this case, near the familiar Cancer Alley. Residents have been exposed to toxic chemicals in the air, water, and soil for years. Then Hurricane Laura struck. Laura's landfall was a borderline Category 5, the strongest since 1856. Hurricane Laura devastated the area. People who could evacuated, and those who could not stayed. Remember, this is right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Then a chemical fire broke out at a biolab facility and burned for 3 days, sending what was thought to be millions of gallons of chlorine gas into the nearby EJ community and beyond. A shelter-in-place order was issued, and because of that order and directions to keep windows and doors closed and not use air conditioners, people may have been at an increased risk of COVID-19 infection and adverse health effects from the chlorine gas, on top of the danger from emissions occurring during facility shutdowns in advance of the hurricane. The temperature was also a sweltering 90 degrees. The chemical plant fire put residents at risk of breathing in toxic air, which contributes to the underlying health conditions that make COVID-19 more likely to kill. Research has shown that Black, Latinx, Native American, and Indigenous communities in high environmental risk areas have higher death rates. All of this is on top of the danger and trauma from a climate change-fueled storm. Hurricane Laura killed 32 people in Louisiana and was predicted to cause unsurvivable storm surges. This is a perfect example of the confluence of conditions that make up a syndemic. Communities should have been made aware of the presence of dangerous toxic chemicals and should have been part of any plan to address releases of toxic substances. Furthermore, there is no standardized federal guideline for keeping people safe from COVID-19 transmission during evacuations. The final challenge with COVID-19 in communities of color is the lack of racial and ethnic data. That data would have been instrumental in developing policy around vaccine administration, for example. And that way, the most impacted would have been vaccinated first. Instead, people in harm's way have to hope that their local leadership has a plan. It is beyond time for this country to address and alleviate the factors that make up this endemic. And for that reason, I'm very pleased that this hearing is occurring. Thank you.
Most welcome, and thank you all to our witnesses. We thank you all for your participation again and your opening statements. We'll now move to member questions, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Logan, I want to start with you because I believe you were named as a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Do you believe the Biden administration has properly elevated the importance of environmental justice in its energy, environmental, and climate policies?
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Definitely, the administration is elevating environmental justice to a point that we have not seen before at this level. But really, there's a lot of work to do. And I encourage not just administration across all the agencies, but also legislators at the federal level, the state level, and the local level to join in, because this is a crisis that we really need to address in totality and as a collective effort. So it's a good start. It's probably the best we've seen in terms of really focusing and addressing environmental justice, but there's a lot of work ahead of us and a lot of learning to do as well.
Okay, thank you. The Justice 40 initiative has been one of the priorities of this administration, and this committee has adopted a similar requirement that 40% of the investments in the Clean Future Act directly benefit environmental justice communities. So, Mr. Logan, again, do you have any thoughts on the ongoing development of the Justice 40 commitment and how we can make sure that it is implemented in a way that leads to meaningful engagement and investment in frontline communities?
Thank you again, Chairman Tonko. And just to be clear, I am not representing the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council on this panel. So I just wanted to be really clear about that. There's tons of work to do in terms of that investment, making sure that we get the amount of resources to the communities that are in most need. So developing the mapping tools, identifying the communities, identifying the resources, and making sure that those resources are not leveraged through particular mechanisms that will create more harm, in effect, zeroing out the benefits of the Justice 40 in communities because of creating basically sacrifice zones. So there's, again, a lot of work to do. I think that the intention is great, but there's work to do in terms of identifying where to get those resources to what communities that are in most need.
Right. And Dr. Hollis and Dr. McLean, is there anything that you would like to mention on the importance of the Justice 40 initiative? Either of you?
Actually, I agree with Mr. Logan. I don't have anything to add.
Okay. And anything else from our other witness?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth Jean-Pierre. So I just want to say on behalf of the Climate Justice Alliance that we're encouraged by the ambition in the American Jobs Act plan. With that said, we're concerned about the numerous provisions included that debase the overarching intention of the plan. Last year, when Congress passed its omnibus bill to keep the government open and functioning, nearly $10 billion was appropriated for false solutions like carbon capture and storage, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, and so-called green hydrogen. And so when we learned that President Biden intends to double down on these fossil fuel-backed unproven mechanisms, we found that troubling because we think of them simply as big oil bailouts at the expense of environmental justice communities that bear the brunt of the disproportionate burden. The other thing that's really important is that we think that the administration must make clear the difference between benefits and actual investments in EJ communities, rather than subjecting impacted communities to subjective ideas of what qualifies as a benefit. Federal dollars should be allocated in a way that strengthens social cohesion. So we look forward to discussions about this, but we are really concerned because there is a difference difference between investments and benefits. And then finally, the last thing that I would say about that is that the 40%, because it comes out of New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, was always intended to be a basement and not the ceiling. That the 40% shouldn't be the goal. It should be the minimum of what is required to address communities that have been enduring a legacy of extraction for generations.
Well, I know we're going to hear a lot today about energy affordability, which I agree is important, especially for people with high energy burdens. You mentioned community solar. Can you give us a sense of how community solar and weatherization projects have resulted in reduced electricity bills for people in frontline communities?
Ours
If
is
you could do it quickly, so I'm running out of time here. So just
sure.
quickly.
Thank you. I'll try to talk fast. You know, ours is the first community-owned solar cooperative in the state of New York. It means that both small businesses and residents are able to access renewable energy and reduce their cost, which is important for low-income communities. We've also been able to bring offshore wind to Brooklyn and work with NYSERDA to invest $200 million in bringing thousands of jobs to the industrial waterfront. We're looking at an industrial waterfront that has a history of not only polluting and hurting us, but has the possibility of building for climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. And we're seeing investments already happen as a result of local legislation in New York City and at the state level. With resources from the federal level, we're talking about the complete transformation of sectors that in the past created environmental burdens and can be building for a future that brings jobs, renewable energy, and also address issues of health. So those are some of the things that we're doing, and they involve thousands of jobs.
Thank you so much. My time is exhausted, so I now go to recognize Mr. McKinley, our ranking member. 5 minutes for questioning, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Look, in my opening statement, Paul, I discussed the increase in poverty and injustice as the Democrats do away with fossil fuels by the year 2035. But in so doing, we have to understand, and I understand when we go to renewables, we're going to be, it is our desire long term, but it means we'll be increasingly dependent on renewables. Therefore, we need to consider the battery storage to back them up. So just for the sake of this conversation today, let's focus on the injustices involved with the supply chain for batteries. No, and I'll say, Paul, no one wants to see sausage made, but they all love to eat it. But the same goes for batteries. Two of the key ingredients in batteries are lithium and cobalt. But have you ever seen how they source that material? Here's in CNN, did an article. Let me see if you got that. This is an article that CNN posted of children in Congo being forced into labor to harvest cobalt. Here's another picture of those of it in another cobalt mine in the Congo. We're continuing to have child labor because they're enabling these dictators to use child labor. Or what about lithium? Have you ever seen the ravaging effects of lithium? Here's a picture of a lithium mine. Look at the depth in the community. These are ravaging effects we're having on communities all across this world in our pursuit of having battery storage. So, and for those of us that have been concerned with mountaintop mining, this is mountaintop mining on steroids. And according to Mark Mills of the Manhattan Institute, he says we're going to have, and he testified it, we're going to have to testify, he testified that we're going to move 250 tons of earth to produce just one electric vehicle battery. 250 tons. And in this bill, where there are 650,000 cars in the federal fleet. So just do the math. And it comes to about 163 million tons of dirt we're going to have to excavate around the world. Now, maybe this idea of doing away with fossil fuels makes Democrats feel good. But keep in mind, this procurement's not going to happen in the United States. It will happen in other countries, kind of out of sight, Paul, away from us. We're exporting our guilt. it seems like environmental justice stops at the border. We don't care what's happening in other nations, what we're doing, as long as we get ours. Shame on us. We're devastating these countrysides of other nations to satisfy our thirst for batteries. So let's stop for a minute. We're creating poverty, perpetuating child labor in China and South America, and destroying the environments of other countries. That's justice? Give me a break. So if I could ask a question to Derek Hawley. Last month, before the committee, former Secretary Moniz said, we need to do more of this mining of these critical minerals in the United States. Do you agree with him? Derek Hawley, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can. You're muted.
Yes, sir. I agree with you and everything that you said about the mining. And it's an absolute travesty how we, as you said, environmental justice stops here at the border when we go and get everything we need from other countries.
Thank you. So wouldn't it make more sense to invest in innovation here in America so that we could use our fossil fuels to balance out our needs and to do it in a cleaner way? Wouldn't that make more sense?
Yes, sir, it would.
So again, with these policies, we understand, we've had testimony, our utility bills are going to increase, our neighbors are going to be unemployed, we'll still have extreme weather conditions, and all while we're alienating other nations as we ravage their countrysides. Is it worth it? Mr. Hawley, is it worth it?
No, sir, it's not. No, sir, it's not. And you talk about the precious minerals that we need to produce the stuff that we need. We have one mine up in Minnesota right now that produces cobalt, and environmental groups want to shut that down. And it's just an awful travesty. It's just a shame.
And the president just stopped a copper mine that we need in Arizona. I just think this is just hypocritical issue in many respects on it. And I don't think we as a country, we're doing justice to the world by what we're trying to accomplish here. So I thank all of you, and I yield back, Paul, anytime.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Chairman Pallone from the full committee for 5 minutes to ask questions. Please, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. I wanted to focus on the environmental justice title of the Clean Future Act and just a few examples. With regard to Superfund, the Clean Future Act creates several new requirements. First, it requires the federal government to identify all federal Superfund sites that are vulnerable to extreme weather associated with climate change and to clean up all of those sites within 10 years. So let me start with Dr. Hollis. How can cleaning up those sites quickly protect environmental justice communities?
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. That's a great question. What we found is that these facilities, these Superfund sites have been in existence for years, and they are vulnerable to activities like climate change. We've seen that, for example, in Port Arthur, Texas, in instances of extreme flooding, where contaminants from the site have washed literally down the street where communities live, increasing their exposure and increasing the amount of cumulative exposure to contaminants. And we've also seen the fact that some of these facilities, which are already unsafe, are exacerbated in situations of extreme weather. And we know that they have not necessarily been the focus of cleanup in years. And for that reason, we need a faster cleanup. We need to think about the communities that are located around these facilities and how impacted they are, and do our best to mitigate that.
Thank you. And then the Clean Future Act also creates new financial responsibility requirements that incentivize chemical facilities to adapt for climate change, to prevent toxic releases during extreme weather events like hurricanes. And we know that these facilities are often located in environmental justice communities. So let me ask Dr. Mclean, why is it important for fence line communities to prevent these releases whenever possible? Dr. Mclean, were you guys able to hear my question? Maybe not. I don't know if they were able to. Chairman, were we able?
We can hear you, Frank. We can hear you. I'm not sure where Dr. McLean is.
Dr. McLean isn't there.
Chairman Pallone, we're having some technical difficulties there. You might direct your question to Dr. Hollis, please.
Okay. So Dr. Hollis, do you want me to repeat that for you? It said under the Clean Future Act, we create new financial responsibility facilities to adopt for climate change to prevent toxic releases during extreme weather. We know that these facilities are located often in environmental justice communities. Could you explain why it's important for fence line communities to prevent these releases when possible?
Yes, and a quick answer would be the example that I gave earlier about the syndemic, what happened in Lake Charles, Louisiana, when the community, which is a fence line community, was potentially impacted from chlorine gas if it had been released at higher amounts. In addition to the exposure that communities face when facilities shut down for either maintenance or in anticipation of extreme weather conditions. So it's important that we, once again, stop that exposure. Some of it is immeasurable. We don't know the quantity, but we do know that people at the fence line and in the communities are becoming ill. Thank you.
May I add something to this?
Who's that?
It's Elizabeth again. May I add something to this, please?
Yeah, but then I wanted to ask you a question too, so we're running out.
Okay, cool. All right,
Let me go to you. Let me go to you next. All right.
Um,
I just wanted to mention that under the bill, facilities that did not adapt will pay user fees into the Superfund Trust Fund, which supports the Superfund cleanups. And that funding is important because it would build on the president's effort in the American Jobs Plan to reinstate the Superfund tax. But on brownfields, I wanted to ask you, with regard to brownfields, the Clean Future Act includes $6 billion over 10 years for brownfields redevelopment. And that's long been, as I said before, a bipartisan issue. So what I wanted to ask Dr. Yampier is, Ms. Yampier, based on your experience, how could this brownfields investment help environmental justice communities build back better? And if you want to mention the other two, that's fine. But I wanted to ask you about brown.
Thank you so much. So quickly, I served as chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and predicted that industrial waterfronts would be hit by extreme weather events. And we saw that happen in Katrina. We saw it happen in New York. We saw that happen in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria, a place that has 23 superfunds, a tiny island like that. So those investments really need to work to prevent toxic exposure, the exposure to toxics and toxicants. When this happens, when a Cat 5 hurricane hits one of these islands or one of our communities, those toxicants and those toxics are released in the air, in the groundwater. They land in people's buildings. They literally are everywhere. And there is no baseline research to determine what the exposure is. There is no way of comparing it. So those resources have to be investing in not only redeveloping those properties and using them as vehicles for economic development in our community, but addressing the kind of environmental harm that is actually cost lives already. And there's a study that came out of the NEJAC that year. It happens right after Superstorm Sandy, that documents all of the different communities all over the United States where that was possible. And then we saw it happen in Houston. So I would urge you to look at that study and make sure that we operationalize the recommendations that came out of that advisory group. Because I always feel that we're starting from scratch when we have been talking about this. But thank you so much for the question. It's an important one.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentlemen, you're welcome. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rogers, Representative Rogers, for 5 minutes. She's our full committee ranking member. So welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start with some questions for Dr. Hawley, or Mr. Hawley. I appreciated you outlining how important affordable energy is for people, and especially for people most in need. And that's been a key focus as we are reviewing the bills before us. My state of Washington, the state of Washington enjoys some of the lowest electricity rates in the country. And that's thanks to abundant hydropower. Nearly 70% of our electricity comes from hydropower. And we hope to keep it that way. You know, it helps families and it helps us grow our economy. It is an economic advantage to us, a competitive advantage. But as you look across the country, low rates are not everywhere. And in those places where it creates burdens for low-income communities. A review of Department of Energy data shows that states with the highest low-income energy burdens are in the southeastern United States. And this is where most of their electricity is used for heating and cooling. Low-income households in those states use almost 40% more electricity than the national average for low-income households. The good news is that in these southeastern states, they also enjoy some of the lowest electricity rates in the nation. So, Mr. Hawley, what happens to low-income households in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, or South Carolina if climate policies force them to pay the same rates as residents in California or even Connecticut, where prices are nearly twice as high?
Now, I can't speak because I'm not in everyone's household. I don't know what everybody's income is, but it will certainly drive up the electricity rates for everyone in these communities. And I will also add, Ranking Member, that these same communities that are screaming environmental justice are the same communities that are being impacted by energy poverty.
Well, and maybe speak a little bit to the economic opportunities that would also be harmed if businesses and industries had to pay those higher rates.
No, I don't think anyone can afford these rates. And just as a small business owner, I know how we've been impacted right now with COVID. And so I don't think it would be prudent to implement any of these policies that will essentially raise the rate for consumers and business owners.
So there's provisions in the legislation before us where it would mean that projects will not be able to get permits if they are, quote, overburdened, if they are found in one of these overburdened census tracts, even if it doesn't contribute to, even if they aren't the ones contributing to the burden. So what's your view of that?
I just think, with the federal government, we need to leave some of this responsibility to the states. They know what they need in these areas. So I think that when the federal government starts meddling in the states, sometimes that creates an overburden because, again, they know what they need down there in those states more so than we do.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, the White House Council of Economic Advisors analyzed the potential for opportunity zones last year. Can you talk about what they estimated those impacts on poverty would be and how many people would be lifted out of poverty with good paying jobs?
Sure. And so the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that over 1 million Americans would be lifted out of poverty over the next 10 years as a result of this policy. They also estimate that the residents, when we look at opportunity zones and kind of isolate those census tracts across the country, that the poverty rate in opportunity zones will drop by 11%.
That's great. That's great. Just really appreciate your work on it too. So the Republicans on this committee have released a package of bills. We call it Securing Cleaner American Energy.
Yes.
It's part of our agenda, and it's focused on creating cleaner, more affordable, more secure energy, which is so important from a national security perspective, but also an economic perspective, and also about creating jobs and lifting people out of poverty.
Sure.
Could you just speak to what you see in that bill and how you believe it may impact distressed communities?
Yeah, I think the most exciting parts are the parts that deal with innovation. So the CCUS Innovation Act, the Clean Energy Hydrant Innovation Act, those policies both have elements where you're partnering with the Loan Guarantee Program at DOE, and you can see that kind of cross-agency coordination that we've seen potentially between DOE and opportunity zones, similar to what we saw from EPA around brownfield remediation and opportunity zones. So those elements were very exciting.
Yes, I completely agree. American ingenuity, leading the way, bringing down carbon emissions, creating more opportunities.
Absolutely.
I've exceeded my time. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Representative Teguet, who serves as our chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight. So, Representative Teguet.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This is a really important hearing. Yeah, and I just want to say the name of the hearing because I think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may have forgotten about what this hearing is about. It's called Protection from Cumulative Emissions and Under Enforcement of Environmental Law Act. And that's my bill. And then there's a bunch of other bills that are included in the hearing that are talking about environmental justice and how we clean up environmentally contaminated sites. In my congressional district, I have some neighborhoods, Swansea, Elyria, and Globeville. These neighborhoods are classic environmental justice communities. They suffer from highways going right through the middle, from railways, refineries, other historical polluters. They're neighborhoods full of working class Americans who have suffered incredible health damage and other damages from this pollution. Now, so what my bill does is it requires the EPA to develop and implement a protocol for addressing cumulative health impacts of multiple sources of pollution. I can understand how my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would like to talk about renewable energy versus traditional energy and how they'd like to debate that and how they'd like to change the subject. I guess I can understand that. But what I really can't understand is how not either of their witnesses or one of the members is willing to talk about how we address cleanup of these environmental justice areas. Now, I must say Mr. Hawkins did talk about opportunity zones, and he did do some good work with his former boss, Senator Scott, on that. I support opportunity zones, but those are about economic development. It's not talking about cleanup of environmental contamination in these neighborhoods. And that's what we need to talk about. And so I have some questions, and I want to ask the witnesses about what this hearing is about. Dr. Hollis, I'm going to start with you. When the EPA develops a standard for a given pollutant, does the agency typically consider the other pollutants that a community might be exposed to?
No, that is not necessarily the way EPA does their calculation when they establish standards.
Okay. Now, when the EPA or a state environmental agency issues a permit, are they required to consider the other pollutants the community be exposed to? Same thing?
Same thing.
Now, is it possible that if you have different pollutants, they can interact with each other or even make each other worse in attacking our health?
Absolutely.
And are you familiar with I think you talked about this a little bit in your opening statement, the Harvard study about the relationship between chronic exposure to air pollution and COVID?
Yes.
Can you talk to us for a minute about that study?
The study from Harvard, which was also done in Beijing and Italy, suggests a relationship between particulate matter and COVID-19, that the virus particles actually sort of hitch a ride on the particulate matter. And particulate matter is found at higher concentrations, of course, in the environmental justice communities, from emissions, from polluting facilities like that. So communities who are already at risk because of where they live are more at risk because the particulate matter allows the COVID-19 to embed itself deeper into the lung.
Right. And we know that multiple sources of pollution are a hallmark of environmental justice communities. And what complicates that is EPA actually only carries out a relatively small number of enforcement actions. And so what my bill does is it says EPA identify 100 communities nationwide where there appears to be chronic under-enforcement and work with state and local agencies to figure out what needs to happen to clean that up. Would you agree that under-enforcement of environmental laws is a classic example of environmental injustice?
Absolutely.
And why do you think that happens? What do you think the reasons for that are?
Gosh, now, I don't know the answer to that question.
You got 26 seconds. Okay, let me move on. Do you think that this hurts the ability of the local neighbors to actually move forward in supporting their communities when they see that the government just doesn't even care?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio. Representative Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, I ask unanimous consent to enter an article into the record. This article from Politico, published a week ago, is entitled "The Wage Gap That Threatens Biden's Climate Plan."
Mr. Johnson will do all the requests at the end of the hearing, and we'll recognize your request.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to quote a couple of excerpts from this article, and I quote, "Energy industry workers employed by solar and wind power companies earn significantly less than those who mine coal or drill for natural gas. Energy workers on the whole earn more than the typical American, but the highest paying positions are skewed heavily toward nuclear, utility and natural gas, and coal industry workers, the new data shows. The wind, solar, and construction jobs that would surge under Biden's policies were well below them on the median pay scale." When we're faced with the facts presented in this article, I can't help but ask my Democratic colleagues and their witnesses today, is this what my constituents in an oil, gas, and coal producing district have to look forward to? If the legislation we're discussing today was to become law, thousands of men and women I represent, millions across our nation, will be forced to take a significant pay cut. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound very just to me. So, Mr. Hawley, let me start with you. When we review the legislation in front of us today, the Clean Future Act doesn't hide its bias against fossil fuels. There is a title in the bill itself, Title 10, that actually lists out the fossil energy jobs that'll be lost under this green transformation. These include resource production, power generation, and manufacturing. So, Mr. Hawley, the shutdown of these industries would mean the loss of thousands of good-paying blue-collar jobs that would be replaced with vague promises of lower-paying green jobs in far-off places. Would this help or hurt the communities you advocate for?
Oh, it would totally hurt them, devastate these communities, Mr. Johnson.
Okay. Section 902 of that Clean Future Act would halt permitting for the domestic manufacturing of plastics, including their feedstocks, which we all know is natural gas and the petrochemical products harvested in the extraction process of natural gas. So your testimony talks about energy poverty, that idea that low-income Americans suffer the most when policies are enacted that raise the cost of gasoline, electricity, and natural gas to heat their homes and cook their meals. So, Mr. Hawley, would you agree that this same concept of energy poverty could be realized if there is reduced access to the thousands of affordable products derived from petrochemicals or plastics that Americans rely on every day, those materials used in clothing, food packaging, electronics, transportation, common home furnishings, and other basic necessities? Can you talk about what happens if we devastate the plastics manufacturing sector of our
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I couldn't include all that in my testimony in 5 minutes, but I think a lot of times people don't understand just how much the oil and gas industry provides to us and petrochemicals, but all the things that we need that supply us and that we need to function daily, even down to, like I said, your yoga mat. And I think at the end of the day, when you start taking away these jobs, taking away the industry, it will ultimately drive up the cost for all these goods that we need and that are a part of our life every single day.
Absolutely. One of the things that my Democratic colleagues are pushing so hard for is all electric vehicles. And I'm not opposed to all electric vehicles, but I wonder, do my colleagues realize how much plastics manufacturing goes into the process of making an all electric vehicles? It's possible because plastics are lightweight. and much of the material that goes into an all-electric vehicle is plastic. And a lot of the components of solar panels and wind turbines are also made out of petrochemical products. So I think we're missing the point here in many, many cases. But Mr. Holly, I thank you for your responses. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Representative Schakowsky, who also chairs our subcommittee on commerce and consumer protection. Representative Schakowsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So nearly a decade ago, I met with a young constituent who was concerned about the impact of oil and gas operations on drinking water. And as a result, I introduced the SHARED Act. Of course, that's an acronym, and it's called the Safe Hydration is an American Right in Energy Development, to require testing of water sources near hydraulic fracturing operations, and then the public disclosure of their results. It's a very simple and common sense way to protect communities from environmental harm, and I believe that it is a valuable addition to the environmental justice conversation. The SHARED Act, that's HR 2164. I keep introducing it, and hopefully it'll be part of the all the bills that we're passing now. And it would require oil and gas companies to report on the impact of their fracking activities and what impact they have on the water. And companies would be required then to test the water sources within a half-mile radius of fracking sites, and those results would have to be made publicly available to the community. So, Dr. Hollis, I'm wondering if you could discuss the importance of both monitoring pollution, polluting causes such as fracking by fossil fuel operations, and publicly disclose that information. What do you think of that?
I can do that. I'll do it quickly. The issue with hydrofracking is that evidence has shown that it contaminates the water, the groundwater, the drinking water wells. It also contaminates the environment, the air. The methane is released into the environment. And the issue is that a number of the ingredients that we do know of are carcinogens, are very toxic. And then there are those that we don't even know are included in hydrofracking fluid because of a trade secret, so that facilities aren't required to provide that information to communities, which is ridiculous because it goes against common sense that people should know what they're being exposed to. Because when you fracture the soil, when you fracture the ground, you're creating cracks, and through those cracks, eventually this fracking fluid will get into the water supply, and has gotten into the water supply.
And has. Thank you very much. And it's not just common sense, but I think we're talking about the health of our families and our communities. And every American family really does deserve to know whether the water that they use to cook and bathe and drink is safe, especially from contamination due to fossil fuel energy production. We can't forget that oil and gas operations are also major drivers of the climate crisis, and specifically as the country's primary source of harm from methane pollution. So I wanted to ask Ms. Jean-Pierre, can you speak to the importance of controlling dangerous methane pollution, especially for frontline communities?
Well, thank you for that question. I want to make it personal for a second. I want to share with everyone that a year ago this week, I almost went into cardiac arrest because of COVID and lost 4 family members within 2 weeks. All of us were born and raised in the midst of environmental burdens right next to power plants, waste transfer stations, brownfields. We have all of those things in common from the front line. And so these protections are tremendously important. They land in our lungs in developing while women are pregnant. They affect the ability for children to function in school. They disrupt work. So all of these protections are tremendously important. And so I want folks to know that we're not talking about people out there, some question mark of folks. We're literally talking about our aunties, our grandmothers, our children. And so anyone who cares about children and anyone who cares about families and who is invested in making sure that we live healthy, thrivable lives will invest in making sure that we are moving away from extraction and investing in regenerative economies and putting in those protections. And people, for example, when
I'm sorry, my time is almost expired, but I just wanted to say how important it is in this hearing in general and bringing it home to our families, as you were talking about your aunties, that we need to make that a top priority when we consider how we develop our energy future. And I just appreciate this hearing so much. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I next had Mr. Carter. I don't see him on our screen, so if he does return, we'll reinsert him on our list. So let's go to the gentleman from South Carolina. Representative Duncan, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. I first want to say that it's time for fear tactics like Ms. Hollis is talking about to stop. Most drinking water wells are a deep drinking water wells, 300 feet. Most fracking happens at hundreds, if not thousands of feet below the depth of a drinking water well. It's been proven time and again that fracking fluids are not flowing up from a fracking operation into drinking water wells. So just stop with the misinformation that's out there to put fear tactics and fear in the hearts and minds of folks across America. I want to shift gears. Mr. Hawkins, Shay, it's great to see you. Thanks for all the work that you did with Tim Scott, Senator Scott, on the opportunity zones. I want to start by saying I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity zones in general. And low-income communities will be the last to recover from economic instability. As we work towards relief for American families and businesses to return to pre-COVID conditions, I think the opportunity zones should play a vital role. I know they have already benefited many communities in my home state of South Carolina. How can incentivizing investment in distressed areas establish longer-term quality of life benefits for those residents in the communities compared to direct government benefits? Shay?
Yes, so absolutely. So, when we look at what's going on in opportunity zones, particularly around job creation. So there's multiple benefits. One benefit that potential opportunity zone residents see is in direct jobs. That's obvious. But we also see benefits around better access to goods and services that weren't previously available. Significant numbers of designated opportunity zones are in food deserts. And so, food security becomes an issue. But then you also see that opportunity zone residents benefit from higher real estate prices. And the majority of opportunity zone real estate, the majority of opportunity zone residents own real estate in the opportunity zone. And so, there's a plethora of potential benefits. Representative DeJette indicated that environmental cleanup was the topic of the hearing, and that we hadn't offered much from our side on that. So if you'll allow me, Representative Duncan, I'll just talk a little bit about brownfield remediation and the fact that EPA worked closely with opportunity zones in designating the areas that the 151 areas that they laid out for brownfield remediation. 118 of those were in opportunity zones. And so, it's critical both on the cleanup side for frontline communities, but both on the long-term quality of life side that you laid out.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I want to shift gears a little bit. And Mr. Hawkins, I appreciate all the work on opportunity zones as well. This move toward higher priced and more expensive electricity generation through wind and solar has been proven time and again that that's more expensive than traditional 24/7, 365 power supplies that exist today, and that's nuclear power, that's coal and natural gas fired power plants. The higher price electricity generation affects the lower income populations more than it does anyone, because they now have to pay more as percentage of their discretionary income for utility rates because of the high-priced electricity generation. So as we move toward more higher-priced electricity, just keep in mind that those that are on a very limited and fixed income, and that's the lower income side of the scale, will pay more out of their pocket for electricity. That means they have less money to spend in the economy on other things that they need, whether that's education for their children, clothes, food, rent, taxes, other things that they have to pay for in life. They will have less money to do that. So let's just keep that in mind. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the committee hearing and the comments from the witnesses, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Representative Sarbanes. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding the hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses that you've assembled here today for their testimony. I certainly appreciate the work this committee has been doing to bring environmental justice to the forefront of the conversation. Really, really critical. One of the bills that we are discussing today is the Ensuring Safe Disposal of Coal Ash Act, which would establish stronger protections against unsafe coal ash disposal. As we know, coal ash or coal combustion residuals is one of the largest types of industrial waste in the United States that's generated. And according to the EPA in 2012, about 110 million tons of coal ash was generated. Power plants have disposed of this waste, including many times in unlined coal ash ponds. The coal ash is filled with toxic levels of several pollutants, including mercury and arsenic, and exposure to coal ash can lead to cancers, cardiovascular issues, developmental defects, and nervous system damage. If disposed of in an unsafe manner, coal ash poses significant risk to neighboring communities. I've seen that in Maryland. We've had some real challenges there, and I've witnessed firsthand the impact of coal ash pollution on residents and the dangers associated with unsafe disposal. In my prior district I represented previously, this was a real concern. The Obama administration issued the 2015 coal ash rule to protect communities and water resources in the United States from toxic coal ash contamination. Unfortunately, rather than strengthening that rule, the Trump administration took action to weaken the critical provisions that were contained within it. So it's of little surprise now to know that an estimated 60% of coal ash disposal sites are located near low-income communities. So I'm very pleased to see HR 2396 is being considered today. Dr. Hollis, in your testimony, you discuss how systematic racism is a public health issue. I certainly agree with that. And as you know, this week, the head of the Centers for Disease Control also issued a statement, and the CDC is now going to be examining that link in a more systematic fashion. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how locally undesirable land uses, and take the coal ash pond as an example of that, can disproportionately burden communities of color and low-income communities, as well as their resources? And talk a little bit about the fact that there's a double hit on these communities. On the front end, they're getting this environmental injustice. On the back end, there's often a gap in terms of them being able to access the healthcare and resources they need to actually help them cope with the impact of that environmental justice. So if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Traditionally, and mostly in the South, communities have been inundated with coal ash. It's mostly unregulated, which is a big problem. I'm currently in Alabama. I live in Maryland, and I have worked with communities in Alabama, in Florida, and so forth, where coal ash was illegally dumped not only in the residences, in the yards, but also in the schools. Traditionally, these are low-income communities, and they don't necessarily have the resources to protest the dumping of coal ash. They also don't have the resources to routinely test their drinking water or their soil. And they often, as you said, lack access to adequate medical resources and also to legal assistance. And that's part of the systemic racism that I had alluded to earlier. The issue with coal ash, which as we know is very toxic, highly toxic, almost to the point of being radioactive, is that these communities don't have representation. And only, their voices have traditionally been unheard or often ignored. And normally you see facilities in these near these communities who truck this coal ash residue through the community uncovered and unprotected from community exposure. So when it comes to the challenges, these communities are indeed faced with multiple challenges, including healthcare, legal resources, and the ability to stop this unregulated practice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That was a very powerful statement of why we need the legislation that's part of the bills we're looking at today, and I yield back.
I agree with your sentiments, and the gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Representative Palmer. You have 5 minutes now for questioning, please. Mr. Palmer, you need to unmute, please.
Thank you.
Okay.
I can't wait till we get back to live hearings. So we can see each other, hear each other. Mr. Holly, I really appreciated your testimony. I think it's time that people begin to speak up for energy and economic justice for all people, all low-income people in particular. And I want to focus on a couple of things, and I'll ask you to comment. I want you to respond about the impact of energy injustice. Low-income families face tremendous disadvantages in the cost of household energy. And not only that, suffer health consequences. I grew up dirt poor in Northwest Alabama. We heated our house with a coal-fired heater, a big heater that had a stovepipe that ran out from it, out the side of the house. And it sat in the kitchen. And so I understand what energy poverty means. Right now, households earning the average salary pay about 2.5% of their salary in energy costs, but households earning less than $20,000 a year pay almost 3 times as much, and households earning $16,000 a year pay almost 4 times as much. And there's another study that showed that when you look at the top 20% in wage earners versus the bottom 20% in terms of disposable income, the bottom 20% pay almost 5 times as much. And then you have the, in terms of the energy insecurity and injustice, you have Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and other civil rights leaders literally campaigning for greater access to natural gas, which is much less expensive, much cleaner. You take Pembroke Township in Illinois, a town of about 2,100, 80% of those residents are African American, and they're literally using propane and wood burning stoves to heat their homes in the wintertime. And Jesse Jackson's leading an effort there to get them a natural gas pipeline. And then in terms of jobs, if we were to shut down fracking, it would cost us over 7 million jobs and would add increase costs for the average family by over $5,000. And then the whole health aspect of this, because particularly in cold weather, the British Medical Journal, Lancet, reported that there's 17 times more people die from the consequences of living in colder homes than from heat. And so I'm just so encouraged that you're speaking up for energy and economic justice for low-income families. I'd like for you to comment on that.
Yes, sir. And I would just share that it's been a passion of mine for a long time, for years. And I've had the opportunity to speak to several people in your state and up and down the Atlantic coast who suffer from energy poverty. And I think a lot of times they're misled about the information that they're getting that actually is causing energy poverty. And when you speak to these individuals and you share with them about different policies and different regulations that are impacting them. Now, granted, they're all about cleaning up the air, cleaning up where they live. But at the same time, they are equally just as concerned about the energy poverty and the cost that they incur every single month with the high cost of energy.
I would like to see a show of hands of the other witnesses, since I can see on the screen. How many of you support Reverend Jackson's efforts to get a natural gas pipeline into Pembroke Township to alleviate the energy injustice those people are suffering? Oh man, none of the Democrat witnesses. That's shocking. Mr. Hawkins, thank you for your testimony and particularly for the work that you're doing to alleviate poverty and to create opportunity. I'd like for you to comment on energy and economic injustice.
Sure. There are, just in terms of context, frontline communities are served with cleaner energy, energy that has less emissions. Frontline communities are served with more affordable energy. Frontline communities are served with secure sources of energy. And so, as we look to serve these communities, we have to have that as our framework and as our outlook for approaching this. And so there are bipartisan solutions that can serve those communities in all of those ways without creating harm in the process.
I thank the witnesses and thank the chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from my home state of New York and the former vice chair of the full Committee of Energy and Commerce. Representative Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member McKinley for convening this very important and timely hearing. And let me also thank all of our witnesses for your testimony here today. Make no mistake about it, the climate crisis is happening right now, and its impacts are being felt most profoundly by marginalized communities throughout this nation. We see these disparities when we look at the impacts of climate change on people's health, on their livelihoods, and on their homes and neighborhoods. Ms. Jean-Pierre, it's so nice to have a fellow Brooklynite at our hearing today. What do you see as the connection between climate change and racial injustice, and how does this relationship inform the climate justice movement?
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to see you as well. It feels like a blessing to be in the space with you. This is part of a history of extraction on the backs of our communities. The citing of environmental burdens has always happened in low-income communities and communities of color. Our communities are the ones that are suffering a disproportionate share of the public health crisis. But we're also working at solutions, and which is why your legislation is so important. We're operationalizing a just transition, and we're passing the benefits, not just the health benefits, but the economic benefits to our communities so that they pay less for energy and they don't have to do it at the expense of their health. All of this is connected. It's a long history. And so what I see today is a collective effort to try to move away from a history that has harmed generations and generations of communities. We are, as I've mentioned before, the descendants of enslavement and colonialization. And it's not just happening in the United States, it's happening in Puerto Rico, where you've got ash that were hit by a hurricane. Those ashes ended up miles from where the facility was located, and they have cancer clusters all around those facilities. So there is a connection, and we really can't even talk about climate change without talking about racial justice. Anyone who doesn't understand that is someone who doesn't who's basically pretending that history has not taken place. So thank you for asking me that question.
Thank you, Ms. Jean-Pierre. The inequitable impacts of the climate crisis are exactly why I recently introduced the Climate Justice Act, modeled after New York State's recent landmark climate legislation, which will establish a federal climate justice working group to address the inequitable burdens of climate change on the front line. Ms. Jean-Pierre, could you briefly describe your experience serving on the New York State's Climate Justice Working Group and share what your group is seeking to accomplish?
The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was created to move resources to frontline communities so that there'd be investments in operationalizing a just transition. And the working group is making recommendations. It's a multidisciplinary group. It's cross-sectoral, working to try to figure out what is the language, what is the framework, how do we do it, how do we move away from extraction, and how do we create 150,000 jobs in the state of New York that put people on a track to economic justice and move them away from extraction. We've got several committees that have been set up to do that. We work diligently every week. And, we just because it hasn't existed doesn't mean that we don't create it, right? So a lot of the members are coming from New York Renews. It's a coalition of up to 300 members across the state, rural, urban, different ethnic and race and ethnicities, different class backgrounds, working together to move New York State to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so that's the bulk of the work that's happening in those committees.
Thanks again. I think it's important to note that the Federal Climate Justice Working Group in my legislation will be comprised of representatives from community-based organizations, as well as states, cities, and indigenous nations. Ms. Jean-Pierre, could you please explain why it's so important when we're talking about addressing climate injustice that the voices of frontline communities are helping to lead this conversation?
Because the people who are exposed to the problems are the ones who have the solutions. We're not sitting around complaining. We are coming up with mechanisms, economic frameworks, recommendations for infrastructure, developing leadership, and passing policy to move us away from a history of extraction. We've got solutions, and you're seeing that happen even in our neighborhoods. I mentioned earlier that in Sunset Park, we launched the first community-owned solar cooperative in the state of New York, with economic benefits being passed on to people who have lost their businesses as a result of COVID, who are really dealing with the economic pressures of COVID. And then we're also working on, we have successfully brought offshore wind to South Brooklyn, and we're talking about thousands of jobs and training and working with unions and workers to train them on how to do something that's radically different. And even while talking about bringing offshore wind, because the parts will be coming from Europe, we're also talking about how do we manufacture it here? How do we bring those jobs? How do we make sure that the United States is actually engaged in building for offshore wind so that we don't have to import the ships from Europe? We've negotiated agreements so that the ships, when they come into Brooklyn, aren't spewing diesel and they basically start operating off electricity. All of these are solutions where you've got people from communities talking about infrastructure, about science, about health, and about reclaiming spaces so that we are ready to address the impacts that climate change is bringing.
This is exciting, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, and I thank you for the opportunity.
The representative from Brooklyn yields back. We caught that Brooklyn theme there. So next we'll recognize the gentleman from Utah. Representative Curtis, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, a very long ways away from Brooklyn is Utah and my district. And right on the southern part of my district, we have, I am blessed with the Navajo Indian Reservation. Recently, there was a Navajo generation station that was coal-fired. A power plant just a little over a year ago was a victim of the villainization of coal and was closed. That plant and mine paid out $100 million in direct wages in that part of my district, and $50 million in leases and royalties that is now gone. A nearby tribe who provided the coal lost 80% of their revenue for the entire tribe because of that closing. Along with the Native Americans, other parts of my district have a long history of uranium mining and processing that supported the Cold War. Many of those impacts are still looming today. We've heard about them in other testimonies: higher cancer rates, abandoned mine cleanups, counties overly reliant on extraction industry for their tax base. Coal and uranium mining technology has advanced in its place in these communities, but these communities still tell me their greatest export is their children. And they're working desperately to keep a way of life and to keep their children in the area and economic stability. These are resilient residents. They're proud. They don't like to hear that they don't need to worry because we're going to teach them to code. Instead, they want to be self-reliant and stand on their own and chart a path forward. And I'm really pleased that the opportunity zones created from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act have played a very significant role in their efforts. They want to look to the future and not get stuck in these issues of the past. And these opportunity zones have been a tool to empower these communities to help themselves instead of being reliant on federal dollars. We're all familiar with the saying that if you give a man a fish, you feed him, but if you teach him to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. To me, federal dollars to a distressed area are a little bit like a fish, and these opportunity zones are a little bit like a fishing lesson. Mr. Hawkins, can you speak, and you've done such a great job of speaking to opportunity zones, but particularly in rural areas and the impact that they can have on lifting these rural areas?
Thank you. Absolutely, Representative Curtis. About of the 8,700 designated census tracts that were designated by governors as opportunity zones that are eligible for this great benefit, 25% or just under 25% are in rural areas, and so they're critical in rural areas because the most attractive portion, the most attractive benefit of opportunity zones goes to folks who are investing in operating businesses, and where they hold that investment, job creating investment, for greater than 10 years. And so a disproportionate amount of the operating business investments that we're seeing happen in rural areas. A lot of the urban areas tend to attract real estate investment, but in the rural areas, we see operating businesses. A lot of things that are very important around rural broadband, but then also, again, like I said, we've seen significant investments in clean energy as well, and other job creating and other job creating industries. So, opportunity zones are a great tool for community development in rural areas.
Excellent. Last Congress, I partnered with Representative Cuellar, and we introduced a bipartisan opportunity zone bill to help small businesses struggling. Utah, I'm very proud, has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country, but our rural areas are struggling. And we just got a few seconds left. Any advice you have for Congress on how to make these more impactful in rural parts?
Absolutely. First, we need a transparency and reporting bill that lets us know where opportunity zone investments are happening, how many direct jobs are being created, and where they're being created. And now that'll allow us to know if we need to tailor the program to more carefully target rural areas. Next, we could look to codify the coordination that we've seen across federal agencies with opportunity zones to kind of put that policy and prioritize opportunity zones in federal community development.
I wish we had more time, and I regret that I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentleman yields back. The next person we had was Dr. Ruiz, but we don't see him on the screen, so we'll go to the gentleman from California. Representative Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. The other gentleman from California. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having the hearing. I wanted to talk with Dr. Hollis a little bit about lead poisoning. I think that one of the most pernicious and really tragic contaminants that we see affecting disadvantaged communities is heavy metals. Sometimes it's mercury or cadmium, but most often it's lead, and often from the pipes that deliver water. And I was able to visit Flint with Mr. Kildee and with Elijah Cummings back in 2015 to see some of the devastation that has been brought on that community. But that's in many ways just the most famous example of something that happens all too often. And Dr. Hollis, I wanted to see if you would opine, if you would, on how you think the proposal, legislative proposal, deals with this, and is this what you'd like to see? Are there other things we should be doing? Is this the right approach, or would you take a different approach?
Thank you, Representative Peters. I do think that, as you say, lead is a serious toxic substance, and there is no safe level. Right. And I do think that the issues that we see with lead are only going to be exacerbated by climate change. One, from the water that is runoff, or from flooding and extreme weather. Also, because the pipes that were originally put in place are in some instances corroded or rusted, and that is released through whatever is in the water, as we talked about earlier with Superfund sites and that runoff. We don't know how these chemicals interact, but the thought is that there could be extracting lead from the pipes. So any regulation, any legislation that's considered that addresses that issue is the right legislation, in my opinion.
Okay, so I think that there's an attempt, and one of the difficulties we have in the federal government is that a lot of these systems are managed by state and local governments, and we're trying to figure out ways to help. Communities like Flint is not a wealthy one, for example, ways to incentivize and to assist them in replacing those pipes. Also, one of the problems in Flint is that there's disinvestment from people moving out, which means that the water systems just don't function as well without people there. So I'm very interested in supporting this part of the bill in particular. For me, I think fighting lead pollution is an infrastructure priority, and I appreciate the witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan. Representative Dingell, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. As we move towards long-term economic recovery from this COVID pandemic, we need to be bold, and we need to go big, and we need to be focused on frontline communities that have borne the brunt for too long to achieve lasting economic renewal. That's the key pillar of the Thrive agenda that I'm also proud to be one of the leaders of. There have been a lot of important points that have been made by my colleagues today, and many worthwhile provisions in these bills that will make a real difference for the communities that I represent, and so many of us do. But I'm going to pick up on what my colleague, Mr. Peters, was just talking about. I want to focus in on one provision. I do come from Michigan, and we really do understand what lead in water does to our children, let alone others. So I want to focus on funding for lead service line replacement. Lead exposure is a deeply serious environmental justice issue, which impacts across generations. And that's why I'm so pleased to see that President Biden is committed to replacing lead serve lines in the American Jobs Plan, and pleased that there's language in the Clean Future Act to put that plan into action. With lead service line replacement, the details really matter if we're really going to get it done. So I want to ask a few questions about the specific language in the Clean Future Act. Dr. McLean, the Clean Future Act creates just one factor for prioritizing lead line replacement funding. And I'm quoting here, priority for the use of funds should be given to projects that replace lead service lines serving disadvantaged communities and environmental justice communities. Dr. McLean, just yes or no? Do you agree that replacing lead service lines serving disadvantaged and environmental justice communities should be the absolute top priority for these funds?
Representative Dingle, we may have lost Dr. McLean because of technical difficulties, so you might direct
I'll
that.
give it to the other witnesses then, and
Okay,
I
thank
hope
you.
somebody, either of the two witnesses left that I see, want to answer 3, answer
Yes.
4, answer. Sorry, we're all having technology. We all can't wait till we're back in person again. Okay, so I was going to ask Dr. McLean this. I don't know if any of you can answer this. What level or estimate of investment will this require from the federal government? And I'm asking this question because I don't think we got enough in here. So what do you all think? Nobody.
I do not have an answer for that question, Representative Dingle.
Okay, you know what, Chairman Tonko, I think that with the law, my questions are really focused nitty gritty on this. I should yield back and submit my questions for the record.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Sorry.
Oh,
I was going to try to answer the question because I'm on
But
my
that'd
way
be
out.
great.
From the
Okay,
Climate
please
Justice
do.
Alliance, thank you. First, thank you for supporting Thrive. Senator Schumer has been a great ally for us in the state of New York. We're talking about $10 trillion, about $1 trillion a year, 2 more than is being recommended. We're also talking about a 40% that has to be a baseline and not a goal. There are different communities that have different needs. They're all different, and they've all been dealing with a legacy of extraction for generations. And so the needs, whether it's Indian country versus a coastal community, may be radically different. We're happy to provide you with more information at some point, and I really want to thank everyone for inviting me. I feel deep gratitude for this conversation and for being invited. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And it's an important, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chair, do my questions for the record.
Okay, the gentle lady from Michigan yields back. We next had Representative Barragan on our list. We don't see her on the screen, so we'll now move to the gentleman from Virginia, Representative McEachin. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and thank you for your input on this important topic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you and Chairman Pallone for convening this hearing and the work that we are all doing on the notion of environmental justice for all. I'm going to skip a lot of my introductory comments for the sake of time and just sort of focus on HR 2021 and the notion of cumulative impact. And I'd like to start off by asking Dr. Hollis, how does the current permitting process disproportionately hurt low-income communities, communities of color, and tribal and indigenous communities?
Thank you, Representative McEachin. The current permitting process doesn't account for or take into account the different ways that communities are exposed to different pollutants and the different mechanisms, different routes of exposure.
And thank you. And I had a question for Dr. McLean, but I want to shift it over to, is it Dr. Yempe? Help me out with the pronunciation of your name. I'm so sorry, ma'am.
I think Ms. Jean-Pierre had to leave.
Jean-Pierre. Is she still on?
No, I think she had to leave.
Well, Dr. Hollis, I guess it's just you and me then.
But Mr. Logan's here.
Well, either Dr. Hollis or Dr. Logan, either one of you all can try to tackle this question. How could requiring consideration of cumulative impacts in permitting decisions impact and benefit environmental justice communities?
If I may,
please.
Thank you, Representative McEachin. Environmental justice communities are overburdened with concentration of polluting facilities in very small geographic areas. In some cases, there's concentrations of lead smelters, for instance. When there is that type of infrastructure that helps to service lead smelters, for instance, in a concentrated geography, the tendency is that companies continue to want to serve that area or to be placed or sited in that area. When the permitting process starts to run through, it only examines the permit on its own merits, not taking into account the multiple other effects or multiple other facilities. So it's important that as we address environmental justice, that the cumulative impacts policies really incorporates the permit denial as a strategy as it looks at the potential of harm in these communities. These communities are already overly burdened. Another ounce of lead is just detrimental to the community and continues to harm the community. So permitting is critical, not just examining, not just studying, not just enforcing, because in most cases, these permitting processes are following the letter of the law.
Thank you for that, sir. Dr. Hollis, as we've seen throughout COVID-19, communities of color have been some of the hardest hit. How does environmental pollution and cumulative health impacts connect to the current pandemic? Could a cumulative impacts approach to permitting have potentially prevented some of the health disparities that we've seen?
Thank you, Representative McKeachin. With communities are exposed, as I mentioned earlier, to numerous contaminants. And when we talk about COVID-19, so these contaminants make them more at risk already. We see increased cardiac issues, we see increased respiratory issues, all of these things that make them predisposed to issues in breathing, issues and just having I guess, a healthy environment. And so that makes them more susceptible to things like COVID-19 and not just COVID-19. So when it comes to permitting, as Mr. Logan said, it's important that we look at all of the contributors to pollution, because we don't know which particular combination of contaminants will make a person more at risk, will put a person more at risk for attacks of viruses like COVID-19.
Thank you, ma'am. And I want to thank you both. I look forward to working with you all and my colleagues on this committee to ensure that we pass legislation that protects EJ communities from environmental health hazards. Before yielding back, I'm proud that our EJ for All Act has earned the support of many of my colleagues and organizations across the country. I would ask unanimous consent to introduce letters of support for the Environmental Justice for All Act into the record, including a letter from some of our Senate colleagues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
We'll be glad to deal with the requests at the end of the meeting, and thank you for the request to enter the document into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. I see we've been rejoined by Representative Carter, the gentleman from Georgia, who will be recognized next, to be followed by Dr. Ruiz, who is also rejoined us. So to the gentleman of Georgia, you're recognized. 5 minutes, Representative Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your presence here today and your participation. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from the Georgia Ports Authority, the economic engine of the Southeast, and entailing their work and the environmental work that they are doing at the ports.
We'll deal with that request, Representative Carter, at the end of the hearing, but thank you for submitting it.
Okay. All right. Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned, locally, the Port of Savannah has been extremely engaged in working with the local community and outside groups to invest in forward-looking decisions that benefit the port and surrounding areas. In fact, Georgia Ports Authority has made tremendous investments in the port to benefit the community. They've used the DARA program to replace old trucks. They've electrified their gantry cranes, and they've upgraded their rail infrastructure to take additional trucks off the road and a lot more. However, I'm more worried that programs like the Port Electrification
Mr. Carter, it seems like we've lost you with technical difficulties here. Why don't we go to Dr. Ruiz for 5 minutes and we'll return to you if you don't mind.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing about environmental justice is personal to me and my constituents. To achieve true environmental justice, our government must offer equal protection from environmental health hazards and provide equal access to decision-making that affects the public's health. Environmental justice can look differently depending on the community, whether it's low-income housing next to an interstate or farm worker communities in desperate need of clean air and clean water. In the eastern Coachella Valley, where I grew up, initially in a farm worker trailer park, my constituents face numerous and staggering environmental justice challenges. For decades, trash companies illegally dumped human waste at a site known as Mount San Diego in my district. In 2019, a new illegal dump opened at that same site where mulch fires sickened local school children, closing schools for a week and sending kids to the emergency department. Lax environmental enforcement allowed these hazards to persist at the expense of my constituents' health. Other residents of Polanco parks and mobile home communities like the Oasis Mobile Home Park get their drinking water from suspect wells, drawing water from aquifers with naturally occurring arsenic. True environmental justice means that our government is looking out for these communities with the same intensity as they would for those with money, access, and power. That is why I'm so pleased that we are considering two of my bills here today. First, the Voice for Environmental Justice Act, which would provide funding for frontline communities to speak out against polluters seeking to set up shop in their neighborhood. This bill is included in the Clean Future Act under Section 602 and 610. Second, my bill, the Environmental Justice Act of 2021, codifies Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice, which instructs agencies to establish a process to consider environmental justice in the agency's actions. And it also requires consideration of cumulative impacts in certain clean air and clean water permitting decisions. Dr. Hollis, I'd like to ask you about this bill would impact frontline communities. What does it mean to you to assess cumulative impacts of permitting decisions on EJ communities, and how can community get involved in assessing those cumulative impacts? How do we empower communities to get involved in assessing those cumulative impacts?
Yes, thank you, Representative Ruiz. It means a great deal because communities finally are, the concerns that they've been talking about for years are finally being addressed. And the way to get involved is to have community members at the table, to have as equal stakeholders, to get their input and to recognize community science as a valid source of information, an important source of information.
How about having a community-based air quality monitoring?
Absolutely. Not just at the fence line, but in the community, because communities can tell you where they're experiencing, where they've seen damage from air pollution, or where there certain areas. For example, when I visited a community, I became ill in certain parts of the community. That's where we need air monitors, and we need community input to determine where those areas are.
Ms. Jean-Pierre, one of the challenges my constituents have faced over the years is the attempted opening of new dumps and waste facilities in their communities, oftentimes illegally. In your opinion, do frontline communities currently have the resources to stand up to polluters seeking to do business near their homes?
Yes, they do, and they have. Just this week, we received a proposal about a waste company wanting to bring C&D to our EJ community, and we're already organizing, and we've already shared with our community what the different chemicals and particulate matter
do you think that's enough for the nation and for environmental justice communities, or do we need more?
We need more. And I think we need to strengthen our relationship with the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Institutes of Health, and engage in interagency coordination, invest in participatory research from communities. Yes.
My focus is to empower local communities, and the grants provided in my Voices for Environmental Justice Act enable communities to hire their own experts and participate in permitting decisions of waste facilities. Democracy is about participating in the decisions that affect your lives. And there's no more truer democracy than empowering communities to be part of the decisions that affect their public health and their environmental health. So with that, I yield back my time. I ran out of time. And so I thank you all for being here. Very important topic. I appreciate you, Chairman, for holding this hearing, and let's get this done.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Carter, Representative Carter, we're sorry we lost you. We want to hear from you. Let's give it another try, okay? So you're recognized for 5 minutes. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to mention the letter from GPA to be considered for unanimous consent afterwards.
We'll recognize it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Again, I want to mention that I have the honor and privilege of representing one of the great economic engines of the Southeast, and that is the Georgia Ports Authority. In my district alone, we have two major seaports, the Port of Savannah and the Port of Brunswick. And both of these ports have done a yeoman's work with outside groups and with the local community to invest in forward-looking decisions that benefit the port and the surrounding areas. They've made tremendous investments in the port that benefit the community. They've used the DARA program to replace old trucks. They've electrified their cranes, and they've upgraded their rail infrastructure to take additional trucks off of the road and a lot more. However, I'm worried that programs like the Port Electrification and Decarbonization Program under the Clean Future Act could potentially hamstring the progress that's being made by ports to upgrade older technology. And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Holly, should we be focusing on making sure all these ports get the assistance they need to advance environmental and public health outcomes?
Yes, sir, we should.
Good, thank you. Do we need to be careful, Mr. Holly, about putting too many requirements in place to participate?
Absolutely, yes, sir, Mr. Carter.
Good, thank you again. Mr. Holly, in previous testimony in front of the Natural Resources Committee, you talked about a specific project that could have benefited the environmental justice community, but was canceled, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. What lessons should we be taking away from this about inhibiting or stopping industries from moving forward with construction or upgrades when those investments will benefit the communities?
My goodness, that was a plan that they had the restrictions that what they had done in terms of just the requirements and regulations. They had gone 10 times the amount in terms of what they were asked to do in terms of putting it together for safety regulations. And so many people right now are still suffering because of the lack of natural gas that pipeline was going to produce.
Well, if the goal is to create jobs and to get money out to people, shouldn't we be predicating grants and other forms of money on issues like whether or not the employees had previously been incarcerated or if they have ties to the foster care system?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Holly. Mr. Hawkins, I want to go to you next because you mentioned something in your testimony that I'm very interested in, and that is the opportunity zones. And you've talked about the benefit of opportunity zones to bolster disadvantaged and low-income communities. And yes, I have a lot of low-income communities in my district, and I'm very concerned about them, and I want to help them as much as I can. What's the best adjustment, Mr. Hawkins, that we can make to the policy to spur more investment in operating businesses like energy projects? I think you're muted.
I appreciate the question, Representative Carter, and the best adjustment that can be made is to allow any type of capital, not just capital gains, to be used for the purposes of the 10-year 100% step up in basis. So briefly, the opportunity zone policy has 3 levels of benefit. One based on deferring capital gains, and another one based on a step up in basis on your initial capital gain. But the largest benefit goes to investors that make a long-term 10 years or more commitment to an investment. And so for those purposes, we should allow non-capital gains to be invested. That way, we can democratize the capital that's coming in, but also greatly increase the resources that come in and fund those operating businesses. And so, it's if I could wave a wand, that'd be the primary adjustment I would make to this policy in this next round of legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. I know I'm out of time, but I do want to mention, Mr. Hawkins, that your opportunity zones have been aligned with EPA to deal with brownfields, and that is something that is very important in my district. I appreciate you bringing that up, and I appreciate your work on that as well. Mr. Chairman, again, I want to say this letter, and I'll yield. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Representative Barragan. You are recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair Tonko, for holding this important hearing on environmental justice legislation. My district is majority minority, almost 90% Latino, African American, working class. It's right next to 3 freeways in the Port of Los Angeles, urban oil drilling, and oil refineries, right next to parks where children play. It results in a dangerous level of air pollution with asthma rates twice the national average and high rates of cancer and respiratory illnesses. It's unacceptable. We must invest to clean up and transform our communities. I'm proud that my bill, the Climate Smart Sports Act, is included as part of today's hearing, and that another one of my bills, the Climate Justice Grants Act, is part of the Clean Future Act's environmental justice section. Both offer significant resources to communities hit hard by pollution and the climate crisis. Mr. Logan, first, I want to thank you for your advocacy on behalf of the Moving Forward Network to fight for clean air in port communities, including South Los Angeles, where you have done amazing work. Can you describe the Climate Smart Ports Act? Mostly, how would it make a difference for air quality in Los Angeles and port communities across the country?
Thank you, Representative Barragan, and thank you for all the work that you've done to advance environmental justice in your district and the districts around you. The ports of LA and Long Beach, for instance, is a major source of not just toxic pollution, but also climate pollutants. As you all may know, Los Angeles Basin is one of the most polluted, if not the most polluted regions in the country. The #1 source of air pollution in the Los Angeles Basin is the 2 ports. The 2 ports of LA and Long Beach have done tremendous work at cleaning up their pollution, but with the constant growth and the constant activity of the ports, with all the trucks, the trains, the ships, the equipment, the amount of pollution continues to increase. So we have to stop the incremental improvements and really get down to zero pollution, zero emissions. So investment in zero emissions technology, in infrastructure, is essential for the community's health and well-being. And if you can't breathe, you can't work. If you can't breathe, you can't go to school. If you can't breathe, you just can't be a part of our society. So the quality of life and livelihood of our communities depend on getting to zero pollution, zero emissions in our community. I also appreciate the fact that there are certain requirements for receiving these funds, making sure that it does not displace workers at the waterfront. Automation, it does not mean, zero emissions does not mean automation. If it displaces workers, that's not the right kind of investment. Also, having folks at the table, making sure that we are engaged in a way that is meaningful and making sure that we're investing in communities that need that investment, but in a real way, not just this kind of the side benefit, but direct investment with real benefits that you can see in communities.
Well, thank you, Mr. Logan. Just to follow up on that, I know you spoke a little bit about it. An important part of the Climate Smart Ports Act is the support for zero emissions technology. In addition, the Green Ports program established in the Clean Future Act takes that approach based on my bill. Can you tell the committee how important it is for environmental justice communities that our investments to green ports focus on zero emissions technology rather than, let's say, low emissions technology?
Absolutely. To your point earlier, our communities are inundated with multiple impacts, refineries, urban drilling, rural drilling, all types of impacts from the fossil fuel industry, as well as many others. And so when we're talking about these false types of solutions, such as what they call near zero or renewable natural gas, what happens is we don't just see the impacts from the production of those fuels in our communities. We also see the impacts of the production of those fuels in other communities across the country. The other part of that is with these natural gas vehicles and products, the particles of natural gas are so fine that they are toxic within themselves, that the particles, the ultrafine particles, penetrate the bloodstream and have major impacts on the body, not just on the earth and climate impacts.
Thank you, Mr. Logan, for that testimony, again, for all the work that you're doing and all our panelists are doing. I just want to quickly mention a UCLA study that just came out that tied COVID-19 deaths linked to poor air quality and showed that those in communities that had poor air quality were dying at much higher rates. And so when we talk about devastation to communities, air pollution is devastating our communities and it's killing our communities, which is why this is so important. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for this hearing. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Representative O'Halloran. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. There are over 520 abandoned uranium mines on and around the Navajo Nation in Arizona. These mines have gone unaddressed since the Cold War, actually the late 1940s, despite the well-known health impacts of the exposure to uranium. Minerals from these dangerous sites were used in the construction of homes, children's play area, and some of the sites are still used by children to play on. None of the sites, according to the EPA, are safe. And livestock are also grazed. This exposure has led to uneven health outcomes and even federal programs to compensate miners through the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. I think we must ask ourselves, what would happen if these mines had been anywhere else? While I am heartened that the EPA recently added the Navajo abandoned uranium mines to the administrator's Superfund emphasis list with focus on being completed in the next 10 years, I believe we must do more. Since 1994, the EPA and Navajo EPA have worked hand in hand to build the Navajo Nation's cleanup capacity, and the American Jobs Plan represents an opportunity, a meaningful opportunity to invest in that workforce and get these sites addressed, so hardworking families do not have to worry about toxic exposure on a daily basis. Additionally, water infrastructure remains an area where there is a large disparity between Indian country and the rest of the nation. My legislation to address the Indian Health Services Sanitation Facilities Construction Program backlog is a part of the solution. But several agencies, including the Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service, USDA, and EPA can play an important role in building out reliable water systems and in getting this uranium problem cleaned up. Environmental justice needs may look different in rural and tribal areas, and I'm optimistic
that a whole of government approach can help address the unique needs, like access to clean water of these communities. Dr. Hollis, a question is going to be in a situation like this, where the DLI, the HHS, and EPA would all have a hand in addressing dangerous sites. Why is it that critical for us to codify the longstanding Clinton-era executive order to make environmental justice a part of agency missions and require interagency cooperation to maintain public health and safety?
Thank you, Representative O'Halloran. It's important to codify Executive Order 12898 to give it the strength that it needs in order to clean up these sites and reduce pollution in communities and reduce exposures to hazardous substances, as well as reducing the effects of facilities releasing chemicals into the environment, particularly mostly in communities of color, in our environmental justice communities, be it Black, Brown, Indigenous, Native American, whatever.
Thank you for that answer. Just to wrap things up a little bit, over 1,000 homes have uranium in their walls. This has been ongoing for over 75 years in this one site. These are all surface mines. And there's money from a trust fund of $1.7 million, but that is not going to address 520 sites. And why hasn't that been used for over 15 years? And so in a community where infrastructure has been ignored for decades, how can interagency coordination speed up delivery of critical infrastructure projects like clean water delivery systems? Dr. Hollis?
Well, I think the main reason is by working with communities, is by having them at the table, because that's how you're going to identify priority areas. And that's how you're going to identify what's needed. And I think it's important to listen to what communities have to say and to work with them as partners, and so that to ensure that you're addressing their needs.
Thank you, Dr. Hollis, and Chairman, I yield.
Hey, gentleman yields back. We next had Representative Soto on our list. I don't see him on our screen. We'll go to the ever patient representative, gentle lady from Delaware, Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and especially for calling this critically important hearing. And thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony today. While the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated environmental justice concerns in communities across the country, as has been made clear through your testimony today, these concerns are not new. Generations of inequalities and injustices have placed a disproportionate environmental burden on our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. For decades, low-wealth communities and communities of color in Delaware have faced higher risks of cancer and respiratory diseases due to their proximity to facilities that produce harmful pollutants. We need to expand all of our communities' access to information, and we need to better prepare our communities in the face of a toxic release. Earlier this year, I reintroduced the ALERT Act, which requires facilities that produce hazardous and toxic chemicals to engage directly with the communities where they are located, and to ensure that residents have real-time knowledge of any toxic release. My first question is for Dr. Hollis. The ALERT Act requires facilities that process extremely hazardous substances to hold public meetings at least once a year. Do you support that requirement, and how can it promote environmental justice?
Absolutely support it, Representative, absolutely. And it can support environmental justice by letting communities speak for themselves first and foremost, and giving them the opportunity that they already have, giving them that chance to be heard and to provide input and guidance where needed.
Thank you. And Mr. Logan, first I want to thank you and the Moving Forward Network for your expertise and support that you provided during the drafting of my Climate Action Planning for Ports Act. Something that you said was, if you can't breathe, you can't work. And I think that needs to stay at the forefront of all of this. If you can't breathe, you can't work, you can't learn, as you said. Why are climate action plans like the ones outlined in the Climate Action Planning for Ports Act so critical to advancing cleaner air
in our near-port communities.
Thank you, Representative Flint Rochester. At the end of the day, what we're really doing here is problem solving, right? We have a crisis in our hand, and it has multiple issues that we're contending with. Specifically, when we're thinking about ports, ports are complex facilities, have many, many different types of operations and pieces of equipment. So with the community leading a planning process to identify what the problems are, what the solutions are, and what the action items are, we're able to identify and work towards resolving those problems that we're contending with so that we can breathe, so that the workforce can go to work and still breathe when they get home and during their work hours. And so really problem solving is really important for the health and well-being of the local community. And as we're trying to tackle the climate crisis, again, we need to have a living wage on a living planet. We can't ignore these extreme impacts to local communities and to the planet. And so starting off with community voice and a planning process is essential. And we know that when we come together, we can really find the solutions to solve the problems that we're addressing.
Thank you. I recently had an opportunity to meet with the folks from the Port of Wilmington in Delaware and hear about their efforts at electrification, but at the same time, maintaining the union jobs that they had. And it was a really good partnership. And my last question is for Ms. Jean-Pierre. First of all, I want to thank you so much, not only for your professional testimony, but for your personal testimony. And I think that was really powerful to make this real for people. One of the things that I've noticed in doing this work is that major environmental groups lack representation from low wealth communities or communities of color. And as a result, environmental justice priorities are often excluded from the discussion. How do we ensure that the environmental justice communities are represented and included in the decision-making in major environmental groups?
Thank you for that question. I think that we need to start thinking about governance differently. Climate change is going to disrupt governance, and we need to start thinking of communities as the brain trust of decision making, the folks that have the answers to complex questions because they've been living in the midst of all of the isms. Instead of being thought of as people whose problems we solve, they should be thought of as people who have the solutions and as added value. And I think that oftentimes government always thinks that they are the recipients of their good intentions instead of, and expectations have to be managed. And the truth is that in partnership, we can solve very complex, big problems, but we have to be in partnership with each other.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, I was very proud that our ports legislation was included in the Clean Future Act. And I thank you so much again for all of your leadership in saving our planet. I yield back.
Well, you're most welcome and thank you. And the gentlelady yields back. Very pleased to see that the representative from Florida, the gentleman from Florida, has returned. And we welcome him for 5 minutes of questioning. Representative Soto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. We face a climate crisis that is an existential threat to the human race. Fossil fuels are destroying our Earth, and we're going to do something about it. Our American Jobs Plan and our Clean Future Act will finally upgrade our infrastructure, including creating national electric vehicle systems, boosting clean energy, such as renewable energy and modular nuclear, and use natural gas as a bridge fuel. On our march to carbon net neutral by 2050, to my colleagues across the aisle, what's the plan? If it's just criticizing our plan, that's not possible because the cost of inaction is too great. Nothing is not an option. In my home state of Florida, we face rising seas. We face intensifying hurricanes. When by 2050, we'll face over 1,000 extremely hot days. This will condemn Floridians and other Sun Belt Americans to become climate refugees, and it will decimate our local tourism and agriculture industries. We've been down this road before, we've seen it before, and we're going to work together. In our area of Florida, we've seen over 12 billion pounds of toxic coal ash, with over 6.1 million tons being generated each year. There was a major issue of coal ash being accumulated by some of our local municipal
utilities like OUC and KUA. I applaud them for stepping up by setting a timetable to shutter their coal plants by 2025, 2026, because they don't know where to put the coal ash anymore. And we've seen issues with health in East Orange County. We've seen issues of storage in Osceola County in Central Florida. And in my family's native island of Puerto Rico, they even were trying to store some coal ash in Central Florida, which, while we work with them on many things, was a huge issue, because where are you going to put all this coal ash at the end of the day? With natural gas, with renewables, with nuclear, you don't have this byproduct issue. There are over 42 of these dangerous coal ash ponds, 33 of which are in unlined impoundments or landfills, leading to widespread groundwater contamination in the Sunshine State. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record a letter from 13 groups supporting my colleague, Rep. Cohen's Ensuring Safe Disposal of Coal Ash Act.
It will be entered into a request at the end of the hearing, sir.
Thank you. From the letter, the Ensuring Safe Disposal of Coal Ash Act builds off the committee's Clean Future Act coal ash provisions, rectifying deficiencies in the 2015 coal ash rules and directing EPA to strengthen the coal ash protections. We know coal ash is toxic and it hurts both our brains and our nervous system, respiratory disease, cancer, and other developmental defects. And it would allow local communities to be more involved in the decision making. Dr. Hollis is banning the storage of toxic chemicals in unlined pits after they have been found to contaminate water supplies, a proper step forward to protect the public.
Yes.
And the bill requires plant owners to provide financial assurances for cleanup costs in the event of hazardous spills or disasters. Dr. Hollis, should facilities be required to financially plan for future cleanups that become even more likely as climate change worsens, floods, and storms?
That's a great question, and it's sort of a tricky question. I don't want them to plan for cleanup. I want them to use the best available technology to prevent that from ever happening.
Well, thank you so much. And we know that Ensuring Safe Disposal of Coal Ash Act is a significant step forward to combat coal ash in the Sunshine State and around the nation. We are moving towards getting beyond coal, getting beyond oil, using gas, natural gas as a bridge fuel, and boosting renewables. And that's what the American Jobs Plan is all about. That's what the Clean Future Act is all about. We will take action. We will help out all states, and we will provide jobs to communities in transition. Everyone can be lifted up if we think big and bold and we work together. And I urge our colleagues across the aisle, let us not think of the past and what can bring us back, but let us look to the future, because I believe we as Americans can do everything, anything, if we work together. We know that President Biden has said that many times. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I believe that completes the list of colleagues that chose to question our witnesses today. So we thank everyone for their participation, and in particular our witnesses. We thank you for joining us at today's hearing. Thank you for your input. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days by which to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by our witnesses. And I would please ask that our witnesses respond promptly to any such questions that each might receive. Before we adjourn, I have a list of documents here that have been requested to be entered into the record. So I request unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record: a statement from the Environmental Technology Council, a letter from the Solar Energy Industries Association, a policy platform from the Solar Energy Industries Association, a letter from 13 environmental organizations in favor of HR 2396, the Ensuring Safe Disposal of Coal Ash Act, a letter from the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies and the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, a letter from the Wilderness Society in favor of HR 2021, the Environmental Justice for All Act, and HR 516, the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021, a letter from Senators Duckworth, Wyden, Merkley, Blumenthal, Padilla, and Durbin in favor of HR 2021, the Environmental Justice for All Act, a 2016 report from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights entitled Examining the Environmental Protection Agency's Compliance and Enforcement of Title VI and Executive Order 12898, a letter from our Children's Trust, a letter from the Port of Long Beach, an article from Politico entitled Biden's Green Energy Plans Clash with Pledge to Create Union Jobs, an article from Bloomberg entitled Secrecy and Abuse Claims Haunt China's Solar Factories in Xinjiang, a dissenting statement of Commissioner Gail Harriet to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Report on Environmental Justice, examining the Environmental Protection Agency's compliance and enforcement of Title VI and Executive Order 12898, a letter from Georgia Ports, a letter from the Groundwater Protecting Council, a letter from the Independent Petroleum Association of America, a letter from the mayor of Petersburg, Indiana, an article from Politico entitled The Wage Gap That Threatens Biden's Climate Plan, a letter from the mayor of Gillette, Wyoming, a 2019 report from Ash at Work entitled CCPs, Not Just for Concrete, Coal Ash Makes the Grade in Highway Construction, a 2020 report from the Executive Office of the President, Council of Economic Advisors entitled The Impact of Opportunity Zones and Initial Assessment, a fact sheet from the American Coal Ash Association entitled Coal Ash Regulation and Unencapsulated Beneficial Use, a letter from the Alaska Community Action on Toxics, a letter from the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners, a letter from Black Millennials for Flint, a letter from Chesapeake Bay Foundation, a letter from Coming Clean, a letter from Creation Justice Ministries, a letter from Earth Justice, a letter from the Environmental Defense Fund, a document of support from 13 environmental justice organizations, a letter from the Moving Forward Network, a letter from the National Wildlife Federation, a letter from the Sierra Club, a letter from the Union of Concerned Scientists, a statement from the Western Environmental Law Center, a letter from the mayor of Hazard, Kentucky to Representative Tonko, and a letter from the mayor of Hazard, Kentucky to Representative McKinley. And that list is, I believe, totally complete for today's hearing. And without objection, do I hear any objection? Without objection, so ordered. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.